Welcome to a journey back to the threshold of a devastating winter, a time when the rhythm of human life was bound entirely to the mercy of the seasons and the land. We arrive in a remote, heavily forested valley in the heart of rural Europe during the final weeks of 1708, just before a meteorological anomaly would shatter the continent. In this isolated landscape, a solitary timber-framed watermill stands beside a swiftly flowing river, completely unaware that the great frost of 1709 is about to descend and test the absolute limits of human endurance. To understand the immense responsibility that rested upon this watermill, one must understand the anatomy of rural survival during the early 18th century. The mill was not merely a structure of wood and stone, it was the beating heart of the valley, an essential engine that converted raw agricultural labour into edible sustenance. Constructed decades earlier by local craftsmen, the building was a masterpiece of practical engineering designed to harness the relentless energy of the river. Massive oak beams, hewn by hand from the surrounding ancient forests, formed the sturdy skeleton of the mill house. The roof was pitched steeply and covered in thick, overlapping slates of dark stone, carefully arranged to shed the heavy snows that typically blanketed the region from December to March. Inside the structure, the air was perpetually thick with the dry scent of pulverized grain, seasoned timber, and the faint metallic tang of the cold river water that rushed violently beneath the wooden floorboards. The mechanical life of the mill was driven by an undershot water wheel, a massive wooden structure measuring over 20 feet in diameter. The river's current caught the wide, flat wooden paddles of the wheel, turning the heavy central axle with a slow, rhythmic groan. This rotational energy was transferred inward through a series of complex wooden gears, which were meticulously and frequently greased with rendered animal tallow. This constant lubrication was strictly necessary to prevent the immense friction of the moving parts from sparking a catastrophic fire in the highly combustible, dust-filled environment of the milling room. These gears eventually turned the runner stone, a massive disc of dense grooved sandstone that rotated continuously above a stationary bedstone. Between these two immense weights, the harvested grains of the valley, hardy rye, coarse barley, and winter wheat, were crushed into the vital flour that would sustain dozens of scattered farming families through the barren, frozen months. Running the mill was a life of continuous, grueling physical labour, managed by a widowed master miller and his young daughter. She had grown up amidst the deafening roar of the grinding stones and the damp chill of the river valley, learning the trade through years of silent observation and hard physical work. Her hands were heavily calloused from hauling thick hemp sacks of raw grain, and her ears were finely attuned to the precise, mechanical pitch of the water wheel. A subtle change in the rhythmic sound of the wooden gears could indicate a worn wooden cog. A slight shift in the vibration of the floorboards could mean the heavy millstones were rubbing too closely together, risking permanent damage to the intricate grooves carved into their grinding surfaces. She knew exactly how to adjust the tentering gear, a complex mechanism of levers that raised or lowered the upper spinning stone by mere fractions of an inch, ensuring the flour was milled to the exact consistency required for the dense, dark bread that formed the absolute staple diet of the local peasantry. In the waning days of autumn, the families of the valley brought their harvest down from the terraced hillside fields and distant solitary farmsteads. They arrived with small wooden carts pulled by oxen or entirely on foot, with heavy sacks slung over their tired shoulders. The miller's daughter received each family personally, hoisting their grain onto a large wrought-iron scale suspended by heavy chains from a ceiling beam. The transactions were recorded in a heavy, leather-bound flour ledger that rested permanently on a slanted wooden desk in the corner of the milling room. The ledger was a vital document of rural commerce and survival, filled with thick, textured rag paper that absorbed the ink heavily. The entries were written in a dark, brownish-black ink made from crushed oak galls, iron sulfate, and tree sap, carefully detailing the names of the farmers, the exact weight of the grain they deposited, and the toll, the small, agreed-upon percentage of flour the mill kept as payment for the heavy labour and the use of the machinery. At this time the ledger held no mysteries, serving only as the mundane mathematics of a community collectively preparing for the coming winter. As November slowly turned to December, The routine preparations for the cold season dominated every hour of daylight. The daughter spent her evenings in the adjacent living quarters, a modest stone extension attached to the side of the wooden mill house. A large stone hearth dominated the main room, providing the only source of heat and a place for all cooking. She preserved the late autumn harvest, carrying heavy woven baskets of tough, wrinkled apples down into the deep-root cellar beneath the stone floor. There the fruit was carefully laid out on wooden shelves alongside large mounds of turnips, parsnips and carrots, all buried deeply in dry river sand to insulate them and prevent the rapid spread of rot. She tended to a small flock of hardy chickens in a wooden coop out back, ensuring their enclosure was heavily insulated with fresh, dry straw and that their water troughs were constantly broken free of the morning frost. The long, dark evenings were spent mending heavy wool clothing by the dim, flickering light of a single tallow candle, her bone needle pulling thick yarn through the worn elbows of woolen sweaters and the frayed knees of heavy canvas trousers. It was during this critical period of winter preparation that a severe mechanical failure occurred within the depths of the mill's machinery. A large iron spindle, a crucial piece of forged metal that connected the wooden gearing to the upper millstone, was found to have developed a deep, threatening hairline crack along its shaft. If the iron spindle shattered while the massive stones were turning at high speed under the force of the river, it could violently destroy the entire grinding mechanism, leaving the valley without a functioning mill for the remainder of the winter. A replacement part of that size and strength could not be forged by the local village blacksmith. It required the specific tools and expertise of a specialized millwright located in a larger manufacturing town on the far side of the towering mountain range. Understanding the dire necessity of a fully functioning mill, the father made the difficult decision to cross the mountains before the deep winter snows closed the high passes entirely. He saddled their aging, sure-footed mule, packed enough dried provisions and salted meat for a journey of several weeks, and meticulously instructed his daughter on the daily maintenance of the mill in his absence. He departed on a grey, overcast morning, the sound of the mule's hooves fading slowly into the dense, silent pine forest, leaving the young woman entirely responsible for the livelihood and survival of the scattered community. For the first few weeks following his departure, the weather remained fairly typical for early winter in the valley. The air was cold and crisp, and a light dusting of white snow covered the frozen ground. The daughter managed the mill efficiently and alone, processing the remaining stores of grain and carefully recording each transaction in the heavy leather-bound ledger. She rose hours before dawn, used a heavy iron bar to break the thin layer of ice that formed overnight in the wooden water buckets, and sparked the fire in the stone hearth before heading out into the freezing air to engage the heavy wooden sluice gate, allowing the river to flow rapidly over the wheel. But on the late evening of January the 5th, the atmosphere in the valley underwent a profound and terrifying physical shift. The wind, which had been blowing steadily from the west, suddenly died completely, leaving an eerie, unnatural stillness that settled heavily over the dark forest. Then, a new wind began to stir. It swept down from the high north and east, carrying with it an Arctic chill completely unlike anything the region had experienced in living memory. The temperature began to plummet rapidly as the pale sun dipped below the tree line. Inside the wooden mill, the daughter noticed the damp air growing painfully sharp in her lungs. The river water, splashing violently from the great wooden wheel, began to freeze almost instantly upon hitting the timber framework, creating long, jagged icicles that grew thicker and heavier by the minute. The great frost had finally arrived. By dawn, the interior of the stone and timber mill house had become as dangerously cold as the forest outside. The young woman awoke beneath a heavy pile of woolen blankets and cured animal pelts, her breath pluming in thick white clouds in the dim morning light. The stone hearth, which usually held a bed of warm, glowing embers through the night, had died completely, the extreme cold having sucked every ounce of residual heat up the wide stone chimney. The silence was absolute and unnerving. For her entire life she had woken to the continuous low roar of the river rushing past the foundation walls, a sound as reliable as her own heartbeat. Now there was only a profound, suffocating stillness. The river had frozen solid. She dressed rapidly, layering thick, undyed linen shifts beneath heavily woven woolen skirts and a dense canvas bodice, wrapping her feet in coarse woolen rags before forcing them into heavy, stiff leather boots lined with sheepskin. Her fingers were already stiff and numb as she wrapped a thick woolen shawl around her head and shoulders, preparing to step outside into a landscape that had been fundamentally altered overnight. Cleaving open the heavy oak door of the living quarters required immense physical effort. The iron hinges had contracted in the freezing temperatures, and a thick layer of frost had sealed the wood against the doorframe. When it finally gave way with a sharp cracking sound, she stepped out into a world leached of all colour. The sky was a pale, blinding white, and the towering pine trees along the valley ridges were completely encased in thick, glittering hoarfrost, their branches sagging under the sudden, immense weight. But her immediate attention was drawn to the water wheel. The massive structure, usually a blur of motion and spraying water, was completely immobilized, locked within a solid, chaotic mass of frozen white river water. The undershot paddles were encased in thick blocks of ice, and the iron axle was frozen firmly to its wooden bearings. The river itself, normally a swift, dark current, was now a jagged landscape of pressure ridges and frozen rapids. To an untrained eye, the mill appeared completely dead, a relic frozen in time. But she knew that beneath the surface ice, the deeper currents of the river were still flowing, struggling against the sudden constriction. If she could clear the ice from the wheel and the wooden sluice gate, the sheer pressure of the backed-up water might be enough to break the wheel free and restore the mechanical heartbeat of the mill. She retrieved a heavy iron crowbar from the tool shed, its freezing metal biting painfully through her thick woolen mittens. The task of freeing the massive wooden wheel was agonizing, dangerous work. She began at the edges of the sluice gate, balancing precariously on the slippery, frost-covered wooden planks overhanging the frozen river. With deliberate, forceful strikes, she drove the heavy iron bar into the thick ice, clinging to the heavy wooden floodgates. Each impact sent a jarring shock up her arms and shoulders, the ice resisting with a stubborn, brittle strength. Sharp shards of frozen water flew upward, cutting at her exposed cheeks and catching in her eyelashes. For hours, the only sounds in the frozen valley were the rhythmic, metallic clang of iron striking ice and her own sharp, ragged breathing. She had to be incredibly careful not to strike the wooden structures too directly. The extreme cold had rendered the ancient oak beams brittle, and a misplaced blow could easily shatter a crucial paddle or crack the sluice gate, causing damage she could not possibly repair alone. As she slowly chipped away the thickest layers, exposing the dark frozen wood beneath, she realized the sheer scale of the anomaly. This was not a normal winter freeze. The ice was denser, harder, and growing thicker even as the weak morning sun attempted to penetrate the pale sky. After hours of striking the ice, her core temperature began to drop dangerously. She retreated to the living quarters to attempt to revive the hearth. The cold had settled so deeply into the stones that the chimney draft was pulling icy air downward instead of drawing smoke upward. She carefully arranged a bed of dry, fibrous birch bark and small, seasoned pine twigs, creating a highly combustible structure. Striking her flint against a piece of hardened steel, she directed the sparks into a small piece of charred linen cloth kept in a sealed tin box, her tinder. It took several desperate attempts before a spark caught, creating a tiny, fragile red ember. She blew on it gently, steadily, nurturing the small heat until the birch bark ignited with a sudden, smoky crackle. The fire struggled against the heavy, cold air, producing more smoke than heat at first. She hung a cast-iron pot filled with chunks of ice chipped from the river over the small flames, waiting agonizingly for it to melt and eventually boil. Into this water, she stirred a handful of coarse oatmeal, creating a thin, watery gruel that was the absolute minimum required to sustain her energy for the grueling physical labor ahead. Eating the hot gruel from a carved wooden bowl, she felt a slight thaw in her extremities, a temporary reprieve from the relentless, crushing cold that was slowly enveloping the entire continent. By midday, despite her relentless, exhausting labor, the wheel remained securely locked in its frozen casing. It was then that she saw the first figure approaching along the snow-covered path from the northern ridge. It was an older tenant farmer from a distant hillside plot, pulling a small wooden sled loaded with 2 meagre sacks of winter wheat. He was wrapped in layers of ragged wool, his face pale and drawn, his breath freezing in a thick crust on his unruly beard. He had expected the mill to be running, relying on the fresh flour to feed his large family through the coming week. Seeing the frozen wheel, a look of profound despair settled over his weathered features. The young woman knew she could not turn him away to face starvation, but the great millstones could not turn without the power of the river. She led him into the freezing milling room, using flint and steel to light a single precious tallow candle on the slanted wooden desk. She opened the heavy leather-bound flour ledger, the pages stiff and resistant in the cold air. She carefully recorded his name and the weight of the raw grain he had brought, the dark oak gall ink flowing sluggishly from her quill pen. Instead of using the river-powered machinery, she led the farmer to a small, manual hand-quern situated in the corner of the room, a primitive ancient device consisting of two small circular basalt stones operated by a vertical wooden handle. The lower stone was fixed to a sturdy wooden table, featuring a slightly convex surface, while the upper stone was concave to fit perfectly over it, with a central hole, or eye, through which the raw grain was poured. A wooden handle was mortised into the top stone near its outer edge. Operating it required an awkward, sweeping circular motion that quickly strained the back and shoulders. The young woman poured a small handful of the farmer's hard winter wheat into the eye, and the farmer grasped the handle. The grinding sounded like coarse sand being crushed between heavy rocks, a harsh, grating noise that filled the otherwise silent room. It took immense effort to get the heavy top stone moving, and once it was in motion, it required constant, rhythmic exertion to maintain the momentum. Every few minutes they had to stop to sweep the small amounts of coarse, uneven flour that emerged from the edges of the stones into a wooden collection trough. The flour produced this way was far inferior to the fine, consistent powder created by the great river-driven millstones. It contained large fragments of bran and sometimes even small chips of the basalt stones themselves, resulting in a bread that was dense, hard and rough on the teeth. Yet, in the face of the great frost, it was the difference between life and starvation. When they finally finished 3 hours later, she carefully swept every particle of the precious flour into his empty sacks, taking no toll for the mill, knowing that every ounce was critical for his family's survival. As the farmer departed into the fading grey light of the afternoon, she returned to the ledger to finalize the entry. She wiped the freezing ink from her quill on a scrap of wool and carefully closed the heavy brass-clasped cover of the ledger. The book itself was a massive object, its spine reinforced with thick, rigid leather cords and its corners capped with hammered brass to protect it from the constant friction of the slanted desk. It was a complete record of the valley's agricultural output, a localized census of survival. The mystery of an unrecognized name, written in a cramped, hurried script she had noticed just before the farmer arrived, lingered briefly in her thoughts. The entry listed an impossible amount of rye, more than a single family could reasonably harvest or transport in one journey, and the name itself corresponding to a geographical feature that had been abandoned for generations, a steep, rocky outcropping miles to the north, known only for deep snowdrifts and ruined ancient foundations, made no logical sense. Who had brought the grain, and who had recorded it in her father's absence? The questions were sharp and unnerving, but the creeping numbness in her toes and the desperate need to prepare the mill for another plunging night of deadly temperatures quickly pushed the mystery from her exhausted mind. The immediate danger of the plummeting temperature was not merely to the delicate mechanical gears inside the mill, but to the very foundation of the massive timber structure itself. A severe geological phenomenon known as frost heave posed a silent, catastrophic threat to any building situated directly on the saturated, muddy banks of a river. When the ground freezes to a significant depth, the water trapped within the soil expands with astonishing force, creating immense upward pressure that can easily lift heavy stone footings, warp thick oak floorboards, and shatter load-bearing wooden pilings. The mill house was supported on the riverside by a series of massive tar-coated cedar logs that had been driven deep into the riverbed mud over a century prior by the original builders. To prevent the expanding river ice from crushing these vital wooden supports, the young woman had to perform a dangerous, exhaustive physical routine. Using an old heavy iron woodsman's axe, she spent the rapidly fading twilight hours systematically chopping a narrow trench of open water around each of the exposed cedar pilings. The violent metallic thud of the axe against the dense ice echoed sharply against the frozen hills, a lonely sound in the deadened landscape. The surface ice was terrifyingly thick, and the freezing water that splashed up with every strike immediately crystallized on her coarse woolen mittens and heavy canvas apron. She knew perfectly well that if the ice were allowed to freeze solidly against the timber, the inevitable shifting of the frozen river could simply tear the supporting posts out from under the millhouse, collapsing the entire grinding mechanism into the dry, frozen riverbed. It was a brutal race against the dropping mercury, a desperate physical negotiation with the raw, uncompromising physics of the deep winter. Returning to the living quarters long after total darkness had completely consumed the valley, she focused on her own immediate survival. The coarse, uneven flour she had ground earlier that afternoon on the primitive basalt hand-quern was barely suitable for baking, but it was the absolute only sustenance she had. Traditional bread making in this rural era relied entirely on a carefully maintained sourdough starter, a living, bubbling culture of wild yeast and lactic acid bacteria that had been kept alive in a glazed ceramic crock by her family for generations. Normally, this crock rested warmly on the stone hearth. Now, the ambient temperature of the room was so incredibly low that the yeast had gone completely dormant, refusing to rise. To revive it, she engaged in a practical survival method common among those who braved the harshest northern winters. She took a small portion of the stiff, grey starter dough, wrapped it tightly in a piece of oiled linen cloth, and placed it directly inside her heavy woolen bodice against her skin, relying entirely on her own body heat to coax the dormant yeast back into a state of active fermentation. While she waited for the culture to slowly awaken, she drew water from the small iron pot melting slowly over the struggling hearth fire and mixed it by hand with the coarse wheat flour and a pinch of precious coarse rock salt. The resulting dough was dense and unyielding, tearing rather than stretching as she worked it forcefully on the heavily scarred wooden table. When the small piece of starter was finally warm enough, she folded it into the mass. Without a properly heated domed brick oven, she could only bake the flattened dough on a heavy iron griddle placed directly over the low embers. The resulting bread was heavy, dark, and hard as river stone, requiring her to soak it in hot water before it could be chewed, yet it provided the dense, slow-burning caloric energy required to face the relentless dawn. The absolute stillness of the freezing night was suddenly shattered by a sound akin to a heavy musket shot, followed quickly by another deep, resonating crack. It was a terrifying, violent noise that echoed sharply off the frozen ridges, causing her to drop her wooden spoon. This was the sound of the ancient forest physically breaking under the extreme, plunging cold. The sap trapped deeply within the heartwood of the oldest oak and beech trees was freezing solid, expanding with such sudden, massive hydrostatic force that it violently split the thick wooden trunks wide open. The resulting vertical cracks were often several feet long, exposing the pale inner wood to the freezing air in a catastrophic rupture. To the isolated miller's daughter, these sharp, unpredictable reports sounded like a military siege. The temperature had plunged to a point where the air itself felt heavy, sharp, and physically brittle in the lungs. She huddled closer to the dying hearth, wrapping herself in every available animal pelt and woven blanket, listening to the agonizing destruction of the surrounding timber. The extreme, sudden cold also severely altered the behavior of the local wildlife. The usual nocturnal sounds of hooting owls and foraging foxes were completely absent, replaced by something much more immediate and dangerous. She could hear the desperate, heavy footfalls of starving red deer, moving aggressively close to the millhouse walls, drawn out of the deep woods by the faint, lingering scent of stored grain. She knew she had to secure the heavy wooden external shutters over the small windows. These windows lacked costly glass, utilizing only stretched, oiled parchment that offered zero thermal insulation and could easily be torn. She moved quickly through the dark rooms, dropping thick iron crossbars into place across the heavy oak shutters to prevent desperate, starving animals from smashing their way into the flour bins in search of food. When the pale, freezing dawn finally arrived, painting the sky in tones of bruised purple and flat grey, she returned to the frozen wooden loading platform to carefully inspect the exterior of the mill. The deep circular trenches she had painstakingly chopped around the cedar pilings had frozen completely solid overnight, requiring her to begin the exhausting, brutal labor all over again. However, as she chipped away at the surface ice near the heavy wooden receiving doors where the farmers unloaded their carts, her iron axe struck something unusual embedded deeply within the clear, frozen water. It was not a river stone or a piece of broken wood. She knelt down on the frosted planks, pulling off her heavy woolen mitten and using the raw heat of her bare, calloused hand to slowly melt the smooth surface of the ice. Beneath the frozen, transparent layer lay a scattered handful of raw grain, but it was not the common winter wheat or the standard hardy rye grown by the local tenant farmers in the valley. She recognized it instantly. These kernels were distinctively elongated, deeply dark in color, and incredibly hard, a primitive ancient strain of mountain rye known as Waldstord. This specific crop had not been actively cultivated anywhere in this valley for over 50 years due to its incredibly difficult harvesting process and its requirement to grow on high rocky soil for 2 full years before yielding a crop. The presence of this specific, forgotten ancient grain physically manifested precisely where the mysterious farmer would have stood to unload their cart. It perfectly matched the impossible, cramped entry in the heavy leather-bound ledger. Someone, or something, had indeed brought a massive quantity of this ancient, forgotten crop to the mill in the dead of the freezing night, leaving absolutely no tracks on the frozen ground, only this small frozen testament securely locked within the ice. The frozen block of ice containing the dark, elongated kernels of ancient mountain rye felt heavy and painfully cold against the young woman's coarse woolen mittens as she carried it carefully from the wooden loading platform back into the freezing interior of the mill house. The discovery was profoundly unsettling, disrupting her understanding of the isolated valley's geography and its agricultural present. She brought the block directly to the stone hearth in the living quarters, placing it gently into a shallow, beaten brass pan. The fire had been reduced to a pathetic smoulder, requiring her to sacrifice a precious bundle of dry, seasoned kindling meant for the deepest part of winter. As the small flames cautiously licked the blackened bottom of the brass pan, the ice slowly began to yield, transforming back into clear water and releasing the trapped kernels one by one. She retrieved them with an iron spoon, laying them out on a dry, woven linen cloth resting on the scarred wooden table. In the dim, flickering light, the distinct physical characteristics of the grain became undeniable. This was Johannisroggen, or St. John's rye, an incredibly resilient, primitive crop that grew on stalks nearly 6 feet tall. Unlike standard winter wheat, which required rich, loamy soil in the valley floor, this ancient strain thrived in harsh, rocky, unforgiving alpine conditions. It was a crop born of pure desperation, cultivated only by those who had been forced out of the fertile lowlands. To understand the presence of this forgotten grain, one must look back over half a century to the devastating regional conflicts that had swept through this part of Europe during the later years of the 30 Years' War. When mercenary armies had violently requisitioned the valley farms, burning the wooden barns and slaughtering the livestock, a small group of impoverished tenant farmers had fled high up into the northern ridges, far above the tree line. There, among the desolate, jagged granite outcroppings, they had established a desperate, isolated settlement. The soil was too thin and acidic for conventional crops, forcing them to rely entirely on the hardy St. John's rye. They cleared the stones by hand, planting the seeds in small, terraced patches just after the summer solstice, leaving them to endure the deep snows of 2 full winters before finally harvesting the meagre yield. The settlement, bearing the same obscure geographical name that had mysteriously appeared in the heavy leather-bound flour ledger, had been completely abandoned decades ago, following a catastrophic series of avalanches and rockfalls that permanently destroyed the only precarious goat path leading up the mountain. For generations, the high ridge had been considered inaccessible, a haunted realm of ruined stone foundations buried under perpetual snow. The physical impossibility of a massive deposit of this specific mountain rye arriving at her loading doors in the dead of the great frost suggested something far more complex and troubling than a simple clerical error in her father's ledger. Before she could dedicate further thought to the impossible grain, the extreme, plunging temperature demanded immediate mechanical intervention within the deepest, most vulnerable section of the mill. While the massive external water wheel was completely immobilized by the frozen river, the internal wooden gearing system that transferred the rotational power up to the heavy millstones, remained in acute danger from the penetrating cold. If the residual moisture trapped within the ancient wooden gears froze, the expanding ice crystals would shatter the fragile, hand-carved cogs, rendering the mill completely useless even after the spring thaw eventually arrived. She lit a specialized pierced tin lantern, a cylindrical enclosure punched with hundreds of tiny holes that allowed the candlelight to escape in scattered, protective beams while shielding the fragile flame from the freezing drafts. Carrying the heavy brass pan now filled with chunks of hardened sheep's tallow, she opened a heavy oak trapdoor in the floorboards of the milling room and began the slow, dangerous descent down a narrow, damp wooden staircase into the wheel pit. The wheel pit was a deeply excavated stone chamber located directly inside the foundation walls, sitting adjacent to the frozen river. The air down here was stagnant, smelling heavily of wet stone, decaying river moss, and old grease. The darkness was absolute, save for the weak scattered beams of her pierced tin lantern. Dominating this cramped subterranean space was the pit wheel, a massive internal gear measuring nearly 8 feet in diameter. It was mounted directly onto the same immense iron-banded axle that held the frozen external water wheel. The pit wheel was a masterpiece of pre-industrial engineering, constructed entirely of seasoned elm wood, a material specifically chosen by the original millwrights for its interlocking grain, which violently resisted splitting even in constantly damp conditions. Projecting from the rim of the pit wheel were exactly 120 hand-carved cogs made from dense, carefully aged applewood. These cogs were designed to engage precisely with the wallower, a smaller, cylindrical lantern gear positioned vertically above it, which in turn drove the great iron spindle connected to the upper millstone. The entire complex system relied on extreme precision and constant maintenance. As she brought the lantern closer to the massive pit wheel, her worst fears were immediately confirmed. A thick, sparkling layer of white frost was rapidly forming across the surface of the applewood cogs. The dampness of the pit, combined with the catastrophic drop in temperature, was pulling the moisture directly out of the timber. She had to act immediately to seal the wood. Setting the lantern on a protruding stone ledge, she placed the brass pan of tallow over a small, portable iron brazier she had brought down with her, filled with a few glowing coals from the upstairs hearth. As the dense white fat slowly melted into a thick yellowish liquid, the heavy scent of rendered sheep filled the freezing enclosed space. Taking a short, thick brush constructed of tightly bound boar bristles, she dipped it into the hot grease and began the exhausting, meticulous work of lubricating the gears. She had to manually rotate the massive internal wooden mechanism by hand, a task that required nearly all of her physical strength. Bracing her leather boots against the damp stone floor, she leaned her entire body weight against the heavy spokes of the pit wheel, groaning as the frozen iron axle stubbornly resisted the movement in its wooden bearings. Slowly, agonizingly, the great wheel turned a fraction of an inch, bringing a new section of the applewood cogs into the dim light. She applied the hot tallow generously, forcing the warm grease deep into the joints and the end grain of the wood, sealing it completely against the encroaching frost. She worked methodically in the freezing darkness for hours, her shoulders burning with lactic acid. Her hands blistered from the hot grease and the friction of the coarse wooden spokes. Every strike of the stiff boar bristle brush was a desperate investment in the future survival of the valley, ensuring that when the river finally broke free of its frozen prison, the mechanical heart of the mill would be ready to beat once again. When she finally emerged from the trapdoor back into the milling room, the weak, grey light of the late afternoon was already failing. She was exhausted, covered in coarse flour dust, dried tallow, and freezing sweat. She extinguished the pierced tin lantern and moved slowly toward the slanted wooden desk, drawn instinctively back to the heavy leather-bound flour ledger. She struck a fresh flint, lighting the single tallow candle, and opened the heavy brass clasps. Turning the stiff, textured rag pages to the mysterious entry, she placed the thawed, dark kernels of the ancient mountain rye directly onto the paper beside the cramped handwriting. In the wavering candlelight, she noticed a detail she had previously missed in her exhausted haste. The ink used for this specific entry was fundamentally different from the dark, brownish-black oak gall ink she and her father meticulously prepared. This ink was flat charcoal grey and had bled slightly into the fibres of the paper. It was a primitive mixture of pure pine soot and river water, a crude, desperate formulation used only when access to proper iron sulfate and oak galls was entirely impossible. The person who had recorded the impossible deposit of mountain rye had not only brought a forgotten crop from a ruined, inaccessible settlement, but they had also used an ink that had not been seen in the valley for over 50 years. The immediate revelation of the primitive pine soot ink and the ancient mountain rye was abruptly overshadowed by a much more desperate physical reality as the great frost tightened its grip on the valley. The small stockpile of seasoned firewood stacked against the interior stone wall of the living quarters was dwindling with terrifying speed. In a normal winter, the heavy oak doors of the mill remained securely closed, trapping the ambient heat generated by the massive friction of the grinding stones and the warm bodies of visiting farmers and their waiting livestock. Now the mill was an icy, silent tomb, and the small stone hearth was the absolute only defence against a cold so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing against the heavy wooden window shutters. The young woman realised that at her current rate of consumption, melting river ice in the cast iron pot for drinking water and maintaining a fire strong enough to keep her core temperature stable, her interior fuel supply would run out in less than a week. The bulk of their winter wood was stacked in a massive open-air timber shed, located 30 yards from the mill house, completely exposed to the brutal elements. She had to secure a massive transfer of wood immediately before the heavy, grey clouds gathering over the northern ridge unleashed a potential blizzard that could bury the shed entirely. Preparing for the brief journey outside required meticulous attention to her clothing. She layered a thick, undyed linen chemise beneath a dress of heavily fulled wool, a fabric specifically treated with hot water and friction to mat the fibres together, rendering it highly resistant to wind and moisture. Over this, she tied a heavy canvas sack tightly around her torso to act as an impermeable windbreak, and wrapped her face in a thick, knitted woolen scarf, leaving only a narrow slit for her eyes. She wrapped her feet in long strips of coarse woolen rags before forcing them into heavy, stiff leather boots lined with dense sheepskin, knowing that frostbite could claim her toes in a matter of minutes. Stepping out into the pale, freezing morning required throwing her entire body weight against the heavy oak door to force it open against a massive, solid snowdrift that had formed overnight against the eastern wall of the mill. The landscape outside had been completely transformed into a hostile, alien terrain. The snow was not soft or powdery. The extreme plunging temperatures had caused the surface moisture to freeze into a hard, treacherous, icy crust that snapped sharply under the weight of her heavy leather boots, plunging her knee-deep into the loose, granular snow beneath. The 30 yards to the woodshed felt like a mile of exhausting, brutal wading. The air was so violently cold that drawing a deep breath caused a sharp, stabbing pain deep within her lungs, forcing her to take shallow, rapid gasps through the heavy wool of her scarf. When she finally reached the timber shed, she found the massive stack of split oak, ash and beech logs frozen together into a single solid block of ice and timber. The blowing snow had infiltrated the gaps between the rough bark, melting slightly during the very brief hours of weak afternoon sun before refreezing into an iron-hard cement during the plunging night temperatures. She had to use a heavy wooden mallet and an iron-splitting wedge to violently force the logs apart. Each strike of the mallet sent a jarring, painful shock up her arms, vibrating deep in her cold, stiffened joints. She loaded a small, flat-bottomed wooden sledge with as much heavy oak, prized for its ability to produce long-lasting, intensely hot coals, as she could physically drag. The sledge was a simple but effective tool, built from flexible ash wood with runners bound in thin iron strapping. Binding the load with a thick, stiff hemp rope, she leaned her entire body weight into the leather-pulling harness. The journey back to the mill house was a grueling test of endurance, the wooden runners of the sledge shrieking sharply against the hardened crust of the snow. She had to move at a very deliberate, measured pace, acutely aware of the deadliest danger of deep winter labour, breaking into a heavy sweat. If she overheated and her woolen underlayers became damp with perspiration, the moisture would freeze the moment she stopped moving, rapidly drawing the heat out of her body and plunging her into fatal hypothermia. Having secured a temporary supply of firewood, She faced an even more difficult challenge that afternoon, acquiring fresh water without exhausting her newly hauled fuel to melt heavily frozen river ice. Deep within the dense pine forest, approximately a mile up the steep valley slope, existed a natural thermal spring that bubbled up from deep underground geothermal aquifers. Her father had always told her that this spring, known to the older valley residents as the breathing water, never froze, regardless of how brutal the winter became. The geothermal heat radiating from deep within the earth kept the water at a constant tepid temperature, completely preventing the surface from crystallizing. She took 2 large wooden buckets, suspended them from a heavy wooden yoke carefully carved to fit across her shoulders, and set out into the silent, heavily burdened trees. Navigating the forest during the great frost was deeply unnerving. The ancient pines, their branches heavily laden with massive accumulations of snow, blocked out the weak, pale sunlight, casting the forest floor into a permanent, gloomy twilight. The violent cracking of the freezing tree trunks from the previous night had ceased, replaced by a suffocating, heavy silence that absorbed all sound. The familiar summer path to the spring was completely buried, forcing her to rely entirely on her memory of the treacherous terrain, navigating by the massive, moss-covered granite boulders that periodically broke through the deep, drifting snow. She used a long, stout walking staff to probe the snow ahead of her, terrified of stepping into a hidden ravine or twisting her ankle in the dense, concealed deadfall of the forest floor. After an hour of agonizing physical exertion, her thighs burning from high stepping through snowdrifts that frequently reached her waist, she finally heard the faint, miraculous sound of moving water. The thermal spring was a small, roughly circular pool of dark, perfectly clear water surrounded by a thick, vibrant rim of dark green sphagnum moss and low liverworts that miraculously survived the freezing temperatures due to the constant, localized radiant heat. A thick, shifting fog hung heavily over the pool where the warmer water met the violently cold alpine air, creating an eerie, opaque mist among the snow-laden pine trunks. She knelt carefully by the muddy edge of the water, the sudden, unexpected warmth radiating against her frozen, wind-burned face feeling almost painful as her skin rapidly thawed. As she submerged the heavy wooden buckets, allowing the clear, tepid water to rush over the dry oak staves, she noticed something highly irregular on the opposite bank of the small pool. The snow there had been heavily disturbed, completely trampled down to the dark, unfrozen mud. But these were not the sharp, cloven tracks of a foraging red deer, or the padded prints of a desperate winter wolf. They were the distinct, heavy impressions of crude, enormous footwear. The tracks lacked any defined heel or hard sole, presenting a wide, flat surface area bound with thick strips of leather or coarse woven cloth. The unmistakable imprint of improvised, primitive snowshoes designed for traversing deep, unpacked powder. The tracks approached the warm spring from the steep, treacherous northern ridge, the exact same direction as the ruined, completely abandoned Alpine settlement. Beside the tracks, resting deliberately on a flat frost-covered stone at the very edge of the warm water, lay a single object. It was a crude, hand-carved wooden bowl, exceptionally old and heavily weathered, its surface worn smooth by decades of use and bearing the distinct uneven gouge marks of a metal adze. The bowl was completely empty, yet its deliberate placement at the edge of the breathing water directly beside the strange, heavily bound tracks was a clear, undeniable sign of recent human presence. Someone from the dead, frozen heights of the northern ridge had descended to this hidden spring. The mystery of the ancient mountain rye and the primitive pine soot ink suddenly shifted from a strange archival anomaly into an immediate physical reality. The physical reality of transporting several gallons of water through a deep snowbound alpine forest during an extreme freezing event required a level of grueling, meticulous concentration that pushed the young woman to the absolute edge of her physical endurance. The heavy oak yoke resting across her shoulders distributed the immense weight of the filled wooden buckets, but the shifting inertia of the liquid threatened to throw her off balance with every step. The water she had drawn from the geothermal spring was tepid, but the violently cold ambient air immediately began to draw the heat from the wooden staves. She could not afford to move too quickly and risk splashing the water onto her heavy woolen skirts, as the liquid would freeze almost instantaneously into a stiff, icy armor that would rapidly draw the core heat from her body and plunge her into fatal hypothermia. Yet, she could not move too slowly, or the water inside the buckets would freeze solid before she reached the safety of the mill. As she carefully retraced her path through the deep, treacherous snowdrifts, relying entirely on her stout walking staff to probe for hidden ravines and deadfall, the memory of the primitive snowshoe tracks and the ancient wooden bowl lingered heavily in her mind. To understand the presence of a human being surviving on the high, desolate northern ridge during the Great Frost, one must look back to the brutal realities of the previous century. Following the devastating regional conflicts and waves of plague that had swept through the lower valleys, the high, inaccessible Alpine ridges had occasionally served as a final, desperate refuge for outcasts, deserters, and those fleeing persecution. These isolated individuals, often referred to in local folklore as the Forgotten Ones, were forced to adapt entirely to a landscape that actively rejected human habitation. They lived above the tree line in rudimentary shelters built from loose stone and alpine turf, subsisting on whatever hardy mountain flora and meagre game they could trap. The discovery of the walled-stored rye and the tracks at the spring confirmed that at least one of these individuals had not only survived on the ridge for decades, but was capable of navigating the treacherous, snow-choked cliffs during a meteorological anomaly that was currently freezing the rivers of the lowlands solid. The deliberate placement of the ancient wooden bowl near the warm water was a silent, deliberate communication, a physical marker establishing a boundary or a point of regular visitation. When the towering, timber-framed outline of the millhouse finally appeared through the gloomy, snow-laden pines, the surface of the water in her heavy wooden buckets had already begun to crystallize, a thin, brittle layer of ice forming rapidly across the top. She bypassed the main living quarters and carried the heavy yoke directly toward a small, heavily insulated wooden lean-to attached to the southern stone foundation of the mill, the winter chicken coop. In the harsh agricultural economy of the early 18th century, the small flock of hardy cold-weather fowl was a critical asset, providing a vital source of rich protein during the months when the valley was cut off from external food supplies. The walls of the coop were constructed using a thick wattle and daub technique, a woven lattice of flexible hazel branches heavily plastered with a dense mixture of river mud, animal dung and chopped straw, providing excellent thermal mass against the freezing wind. Inside, the air was sharp with the smell of ammonia and dry dust. The birds were huddled tightly together on their low wooden roosts, their feathers heavily fluffed to trap pockets of warm air against their skin. Their survival depended entirely on the meticulous daily care she provided. She broke the thin layer of ice on her buckets and poured the precious tepid water into their small wooden drinking trough. In extreme cold, chickens cannot consume enough frozen snow to hydrate themselves without fatally lowering their internal body temperatures. To ensure they had the necessary energy to generate body heat, she mixed a portion of the warm water with a coarse mash of wheat bran and crushed river shells. The shells were absolutely vital. Lacking teeth, the birds relied entirely on ingesting hard, sharp grit, which was stored in their muscular gizzard to physically grind the coarse grain into digestible paste. Before leaving the freezing coop, she performed one final crucial task. Taking a small piece of rendered mutton tallow from her canvas pocket, she carefully caught each lethargic bird and rubbed the dense, heavy grease generously over their fleshy red combs and dangling wattles. These exposed featherless extremities were highly susceptible to rapid frostbite, which could quickly become necrotic and kill the bird. The heavy tallow acted as a crude but effective barrier against the biting, freezing air, returning to the freezing interior of the main milling room. The young woman faced another massive, physically demanding task. With the massive external water wheel completely immobilized by the frozen river, the grinding mechanisms were entirely silent, offering a rare, prolonged window of time to perform the most critical and complex maintenance procedure of the milling trade, dressing the great stones. The massive circular sandstone millstones did not grind the grain by merely crushing it flat. They acted as a complex rotary shearing mechanism. The facing surfaces of both the stationary lower bedstone and the spinning upper runner stone were carved with a highly intricate radiating geometric pattern of deep grooves called furrows, and flat, raised grinding surfaces called lands. Over months of continuous heavy friction, these sharp edges became rounded and dull, causing the grain to merely heat up and burn, rather than shearing cleanly into fine flour. To restore the sharp cutting edges, the massive upper runner stone, weighing over 1,000 pounds, had to be physically lifted, turned over, and manually recut with heavy steel tools. She approached the heavy wooden jib crane, a massive pivoting timber beam known as a gibbet, securely anchored to the heavy oak ceiling joists directly above the stone casing. Suspended from the end of the gibbet was a complex, hand-forged iron mechanism consisting of heavy chains and a massive pair of curved iron calipers, resembling giant ice tongs. By turning a large geared wooden winch attached to the vertical post of the crane, she slowly lowered the heavy iron calipers until the curved ends securely gripped the two deep opposing notches carved specifically into the outer edge of the runner stone. The physical effort required to turn the winch and break the immense suction between the two heavy stones was staggering. She braced her heavy leather boots against the floorboards, throwing her entire weight onto the wooden crank handle. Slowly, with a deep, resonating groan of stressed timber and shifting stone, the massive runner stone lifted vertically from the bedstone. Once it was raised high enough, she carefully engaged a heavy iron locking pin in the winch gears, swung the pivoting gibbet arm outward, and slowly lowered the massive stone onto its back upon the heavy timber floorboards, exposing the worn, dusty, grinding surface to the dim light of the single tallow candle. The process of dressing the stone required an exceptional degree of specialized skill, utilizing a tool that had remained virtually unchanged since antiquity. She opened a heavy wooden tool chest and retrieved her mill bill, a short, heavily forged piece of hardened steel, sharply wedged at both ends like a double-sided chisel. This heavy steel blade was wedged securely into a slotted hole cut through the head of a specially turned wooden handle called a thrift. To protect her hand from the razor-sharp chips of flying sandstone, she wrapped a thick piece of heavy boiled leather around her left hand, which would guide the heavy steel blade. She knelt carefully on the freezing, dust-covered floorboards, resting her forearms against the cold, rough surface of the stone to ensure absolute stability. Taking the wooden thrift in her right hand, she began to strike the heavy steel mill bill against the worn edges of the furrows in a rapid, highly controlled tapping motion. The sharp, rhythmic pinging of steel against hard sandstone echoed loudly through the silent, freezing mill, entirely replacing the familiar heavy roar of the rushing river. The work was incredibly slow and exact. A single misplaced strike could easily ruin the delicate geometry of the lands, causing the stones to permanently bind together when the river finally thawed and the immense power of the water wheel was restored. To ensure the wide, flat lands between the deep furrows remained perfectly level across the entire massive diameter of the stone, she utilized a long, incredibly straight piece of seasoned applewood called a paint staff. She carefully painted the straight edge of the staff with a thin, watery mixture of deep red ochre powder and river water. By lightly dragging the painted wooden edge across the flat surface of the stone, the wet red pigment transferred only to the highest microscopic ridges of the worn sandstone, clearly highlighting the exact microscopic areas that needed to be carefully chipped away. She worked steadily for hours in the freezing, shadowy room, completely absorbed in the rhythmic, meditative tapping of the heavy steel. The intense concentration required for the precise work provided a temporary mental escape from the crushing reality of the great frost, yet her thoughts continuously drifted back to the deep, silent pine forest. The ancient wooden bowl at the warm spring, the primitive tracks in the deep snow, the charcoal ink in the heavy leather ledger, and the impossible ancient rye frozen in the ice on the loading platform were no longer isolated anomalies. They were clearly interconnected pieces of a quiet, desperate survival narrative unfolding parallel to her own, forcing her to realize that in the darkest, coldest depths of the Forgotten Valley, she was not entirely alone. The immense physical exertion required to dress the heavy sandstone runner stone eventually forced her to stop. She carefully wiped the red ochre from the flat lands, ensuring the radiating furrows were perfectly sharp. Lowering the 1,000-pound runner stone back onto the stationary bedstone was an even more dangerous mechanical procedure than raising it. She had to precisely align the central iron rind, a heavy cross-shaped metal bracket embedded securely in the upper stone, with the vertical iron spindle projecting from the wooden gearing below. A misalignment of a mere fraction of an inch would permanently warp the spindle or shatter the fragile applewood cogs in the pit wheel when the river eventually thawed. Using the heavy wooden winch of the jib crane, she eased the massive stone down, the heavy forged iron chains groaning loudly under the immense tension. Once the stone was perfectly seated within its wooden casing, she meticulously swept every microscopic grain of loose sandstone dust from the surrounding floorboards, knowing that any residual grit would completely ruin the first batch of flour produced after the freeze. As she completed the delicate mechanical alignment, the subtle barometric pressure inside the freezing millhouse began to shift dramatically. The heavy, suffocating silence that had dominated the deeply frozen valley for days was suddenly broken by a low, mournful vibration whistling through the pitched wooden roof. The great frost was entering a new, violently active phase. The pale, freezing sky had darkened rapidly into a bruised, terrifying black, and the wind shifted, howling down from the high northern peaks with catastrophic velocity. This was not a standard winter snowfall, but a massive, blinding whiteout driven by gale-force winds that instantly erased the dense pine forest from view. The dry, granular snow did not fall vertically. It was fired horizontally across the valley, scouring the heavy oak timbers of the millhouse like blowing river sand. The ambient temperature, already perilously low, plummeted even further in the extreme wind chill, forcing the young woman to barricade herself securely inside the small stone living quarters. She quickly dropped the heavy iron crossbars over the exterior oak shutters and stuffed thick rags of boiled wool into the drafty, uneven gaps around the heavy doorframe. The stone hearth, which she had continuously struggled to keep alive with her newly hauled oak logs, now faced a massive new threat. The powerful downdraft created by the howling blizzard forced the bitter, blinding smoke back down the wide stone chimney, rapidly filling the small room with a choking grey haze that stung her eyes and heavily coated the back of her throat. To maintain the crucial updraft, she had to carefully manage the airflow, opening a small, specific crack in the tightly sealed window shutter to create a deliberate cross breeze, sacrificing precious ambient heat to prevent fatal carbon monoxide from pooling in the low stone corners. She huddled as close to the flickering embers as physically possible, wrapped entirely in heavy, cured sheepskins, listening in the darkness to the terrifying physical assault on the mill. The entire massive timber structure shuddered continuously under the sheer force of the wind, the heavy mortise and tenon joints groaning loudly as the ancient oak frame flexed organically against the storm. The blizzard raged without a single pause for 3 consecutive days and nights, burying the isolated valley in a chaotic ocean of shifting, blinding white. When the wind finally died away on the morning of the 4th day, leaving a deep, ringing silence in its wake, the immediate danger shifted entirely from the freezing air to the sheer crushing weight of the newly accumulated snow. The steep pitch of the heavy slate roof was originally designed to easily shed normal winter precipitation, but the wet, incredibly dense nature of the storm's final hours had caused massive, heavy drifts to freeze directly to the dark stone tiles. If left unchecked, the immense tonnage of the frozen snow could easily snap the heavy internal oak roof trusses, collapsing the entire massive structure directly into the vulnerable milling room below. Armed with a specialized, extremely long-handled wooden snow rake, she forcefully shouldered her way out of the partially buried oak doorway, tunneling upward through the densely packed snowdrift. The glare of the morning sun against the pristine, unbroken white landscape was blindingly intense. The physical labor of clearing a 3-story timber roof during a deep alpine freeze was incredibly perilous. She could not possibly stand on the freezing, highly slippery slates, so she had to work entirely from the deep snowbanks surrounding the stone foundation, using the incredibly long, flexible ash pole of the rake to carefully reach the heavy eaves. She systematically pulled large, heavy slabs of hardened snow down from the roofline, dodging the massive jagged blocks as they crashed heavily onto the buried wooden loading platform. Each sweeping upward motion of the long wooden pole heavily taxed her exhausted, burning shoulder muscles. She worked methodically for hours, focusing entirely on the rhythmic physical task, acutely aware that a single slip of her leather boots or a sudden localized avalanche from the upper ridge could easily bury her alive. As she slowly cleared the heavy, dangerous burden from the eastern slope of the roof, the dark slate tiles finally exposed to the weak winter sun, she uncovered the exact section of the wooden loading doors where the mysterious Alpine farmer had previously left the frozen mountain rye, retting securely on the high, partially snow-cleared wooden planks of the loading platform, deliberately placed on a sheltered ledge where it could not be buried by the falling drifts, was a large, heavily frozen alpine hare. It had been meticulously snared and cleanly dispatched, its thick, pure white winter coat providing excellent camouflage that made it nearly invisible against the snow. Beside the frozen animal lay a small, tightly woven basket constructed from flexible mountain willow branches, completely empty, but bearing the faint, distinct scent of coarse wheat bran. It was an unmistakable, highly calculated exchange. Hours before the massive blizzard had hit, she had deliberately left a small, tightly tied linen sack of the rough hand-querned flour on that exact spot, an intuitive, desperate offering to the unseen survivor navigating the lethal cold of the northern ridge. The forgotten one had taken the meagre, coarse flour and left a rich, absolutely vital source of fresh protein in return. This silent, desperate barter, conducted entirely without spoken words or direct physical contact, established a profound, invisible economic connection between the isolated, freezing mill and the dead heights above. She carried the frozen hare inside the stone living quarters, the immense nutritional value of the fresh meat, providing a sudden, desperately needed morale boost against the crushing isolation. Preparing the animal required extremely careful, methodical knife work. The carcass was frozen entirely solid, stiff and unyielding as a piece of seasoned oak. She hung it by its hind legs from a heavy wrought iron hook near the stone hearth, allowing the radiant, slow heat of the small oak fire to gradually thaw the dense muscle tissue over several long hours. Once the joints were finally pliable, she used a small, razor-sharp iron skinning knife to carefully separate the thick winter pelt from the underlying flesh without tearing the hide. The pelt was incredibly valuable. The dense, soft fur provided absolute premium insulation, which she immediately stretched tightly over a flexible, curved willow frame to properly cure. She carefully preserved every single part of the animal, burying the internal organs deeply in a snowbank outside to freeze them for future trapping bait, and boiling the heavy bones in a large cast-iron pot for many hours to extract every precious drop of nutrient-rich, heavy marrow broth. The rich, heavy, incredibly savoury scent of the roasting meat slowly filled the small stone living quarters, temporarily masking the sharp, metallic smell of the frozen river and the ever-present dusty scent of the silent milling room. Revitalized significantly by the first high-calorie, hot meal she had consumed in over a week, she felt a sudden, urgent compulsion to check the heavy, leather-bound flour ledger resting on the slanted desk in the freezing milling room. She struck a fresh flint against steel, lighting a precious, slow-burning tallow candle, and opened the heavy-hammered brass clasps. Turning the stiff rag pages to the final recorded section, her eyes scanned the familiar, heavy oak gall ink entries of the local isolated tenant farmers. But there, directly below her last official entry, written in the exact same crude, charcoal-grey pine soot ink as the previous impossible notation, was a completely new entry. It was heavily smeared in places, as if written quickly by a hand clumsy from extreme cold, but the crude letters were undeniable. It recorded not a standard deposit of threshed grain, but a detailed, highly accurate tally of the exact weight of coarse hand-querned flour she had left on the loading platform, alongside a small, surprisingly intricate, crude drawing of a snared alpine hare. The mysterious survivor was not just blindly trading for survival. They were actively maintaining the formal ledger, acknowledging and participating in the strict economic system of the valley, even while remaining entirely exiled from it. The profound implications of the charcoal-grey pine soot entry in the heavy leather-bound flour ledger occupied the young woman's thoughts entirely as the relentless, deep freeze of 1709 tightened its suffocating grip on the valley. The mysterious survivor on the high northern ridge was not a feral outcast entirely disconnected from civilized society. They possessed a distinct understanding of the formal agricultural accounting systems of the lowlands. They were literate, numerate, and understood the exact proportional value of the coarse hand-querned flour they had taken. As she stared at the flickering candlelight reflecting off the stiff rag paper, she began to carefully turn the heavy pages backward, moving deep into the historical records of the mill. The ledger was a massive generational document, its earliest entries dating back nearly 80 years to the brutal, chaotic decades of the early 17th century. As she traced her finger over the faded sepia-toned entries of her grandfather and great-grandfather, a distinct pattern emerged. During years of recorded peace and abundant harvest, the ink was consistently a rich, dark oak gall black, and the recorded tolls were standard. However, during periods of extreme crisis, the crop failures of the 1690s, the localized plagues, and the devastating military requisitions of the past century, the quality of the ink degraded dramatically into pale browns and crude soot greys, while the margins filled with frantic, cramped notations of famine crops and desperate barters. The ledger was not merely a book of commerce. It was a localized, highly detailed manuscript of human endurance. The mysterious survivor utilizing the primitive pine soot ink was directly tapping into this historical lineage of survival, employing the exact same desperate methods used by the valley's ancestors during previous eras of catastrophic collapse. Stepping out onto the buried wooden loading platform the following morning, the young woman was confronted by a meteorological phenomenon of terrifying ethereal beauty that confirmed the valley was locked beneath a massive stationary dome of high-pressure Arctic air. The sky had cleared completely of the heavy blizzard clouds, revealing an atmosphere of pale crystalline blue. Suspended low on the eastern horizon, the rising sun was flanked by two distinct, intensely bright luminous spots, creating the illusion of three suns burning simultaneously in the freezing sky. This optical phenomenon, known historically as a parhelion or sundogs, was caused by the refraction of sunlight through millions of microscopic, hexagonal ice crystals suspended in the violently cold, motionless air. While breathtaking to observe, any seasoned inhabitant of the northern forests understood that the appearance of sundogs was a dire atmospheric warning. It signaled a total absence of atmospheric moisture and a catastrophic sustained drop in ambient temperature. The air was now so brutally cold that any exposed skin began to painfully tighten and lose sensation within seconds. The snow underfoot no longer crunched. It squeaked with a sharp, high-pitched metallic sound, the individual snowflakes having frozen into rigid, abrasive shards of ice. The immediate nutritional reality of surviving this extreme temperature drop required careful, calculated dietary management. While the frozen alpine hare provided a massive, rich source of essential protein and heavy fats, a human body performing grueling physical labor in sub-zero temperatures cannot survive on lean meat alone without eventually suffering from a dangerous metabolic condition known as protein poisoning. She desperately needed dense carbohydrates to sustain her core body temperature. With the valley's communal grain stores locked safely away in the freezing mill bins, stores she absolutely refused to touch, knowing the entire village would depend on them when the thaw finally arrived, she was forced to rely on a highly laborious ancient famine practice documented in the oldest, most degraded pages of the heavy ledger. She needed to harvest the inner bark of the ancient Scots pines. She retrieved a specialized heavy iron tool from the frosty depths of the wooden tool chest, a bark spud featuring a long, stout ash handle and a wide, curved steel blade sharpened to a chisel edge on one side. Bundled in every available layer of heavy wool and cured sheepskin, she waded out into the deep, powdery snowdrifts left by the blizzard, moving slowly toward the dense, shadowy edge of the surrounding forest. Selecting a young, healthy pine tree with a trunk roughly the diameter of her own waist, she used a small iron hand axe to carefully score a long vertical rectangle through the thick, rough outer bark. She then wedged the curved steel blade of the bark spud into the deep cut, using her heavy leather boots to forcefully push the tool upward. The dark, heavily armoured outer bark snapped and peeled away in thick, resinous chunks, exposing the pale, smooth layer beneath. This was the phloem, the living cambium layer of the tree that transported vital nutrients. Using a smaller, incredibly sharp skinning knife, she meticulously scraped long, thin, pale strips of this inner bark from the freezing wood. The physical labour was agonizing. Her breath plumed in thick clouds, freezing instantly onto her woolen scarf, while her thick mittens became heavily coated in sticky, freezing pine resin that rapidly hardened into an unyielding shell. She harvested only what she absolutely needed, carefully taking strips from only one side of the tree to ensure the ancient pine would survive the trauma. before turning back toward the heavy timber silhouette of the mill. Once safely inside the small, smoke-stone living quarters, the complex process of transforming the raw tree cambium into digestible food began. The long, pale strips of inner bark were far too fibrous and heavily laden with bitter tannins to be consumed raw. She carefully arranged the strips on a flat iron griddle, placed directly over the low, glowing oak embers of the hearth. As the intense, dry heat slowly baked the moisture out of the wood, the small stone room filled with an incredibly strong, heavy scent of roasting pine resin and sharp wood smoke. The strips slowly curled and darkened, turning brittle and dry. Once they were completely dehydrated, she carried them into the freezing milling room to the heavy wooden table holding the primitive basalt hand-quern. Grinding the roasted bark required immense physical downward pressure, the heavy upper stone tearing the brittle fibers apart with a harsh, grating sound. The resulting powder was not flour, but a coarse, dark reddish-brown dust that smelled intensely of the deep forest. Returning to the hearth, she mixed this bitter, resinous bark powder with a small handful of the crushed wheat bran she usually reserved for the chickens, binding it together with heavily boiled water and a spoonful of the precious, rich marrow fat she had rendered from the Alpine hare. The resulting dough was incredibly dense, sticky, and visually resembled dark, wet clay. She flattened it into thin, round cakes and baked them on the hot iron griddle. This famine bread, heavily documented in the margins of the ancient ledger during the darkest years of the previous century, was harsh, intensely bitter, and incredibly difficult to chew, tasting of wood ash and sharp resin. Yet, as it settled heavily in her stomach, it provided the slow-burning, dense, complex carbohydrates her body desperately required to maintain its internal furnace against the crushing, inescapable cold of the Parhelion sky. Before the weak, pale light of the short afternoon completely faded, she prepared a new, highly deliberate offering for the wooden loading platform. The silent trade established with the forgotten survivor of the northern ridge required maintenance. This time, she did not offer coarse flour. Instead, she went to a small, heavily bound wooden chest kept hidden beneath her straw mattress and extracted a single solid lump of coarse, unrefined grey rock salt. In the rural, isolated economy of the early 18th century, pure rock salt was an incredibly rare, highly valuable commodity, essential for preserving meat and preventing fatal dehydration during prolonged periods of heavy labour. It was a resource completely absent from the high, desolate Alpine ridges. She carefully wrapped the heavy, crystalline lump in a small square of oiled linen, tying it tightly with a piece of spun wool. She carried it out to the snow-cleared wooden ledge of the loading platform, placing it precisely where the frozen hare had been left days prior. As she retreated back into the freezing shadows of the mill, she listened to the terrifying, deep, percussive booming of the frozen river ice expanding and cracking under the plunging temperatures. A violent, natural cannonade that constantly threatened to crush the structural cedar pilings supporting her fragile wooden world. The deep, percussive booming of the frozen river was not merely an intimidating noise echoing through the dark valley. It was the acoustic signature of immense, localized geological destruction. As the ambient temperature plunged further under the clear, brutal sky, the water trapped beneath the thick surface ice had absolutely nowhere to expand as it rapidly crystallized. This created a hydrostatic pressure of incomprehensible force, a silent, slow-moving violence that constantly sought the weakest point of resistance. Unfortunately for the young woman, that exact point of resistance was the line of massive, tar-coated cedar pilings supporting the entire eastern foundation of the heavy timber mill house. The deep trenches she had painstakingly chopped around the wooden posts days earlier had completely frozen over, turning into solid rings of iron-hard ice that now gripped the ancient timber with crushing intensity. If this pressure was not immediately relieved, the expanding ice sheet would simply shear the heavy cedar logs right at the waterline, collapsing the massive grinding mechanisms and the stone living quarters directly into the frozen riverbed. She could not wait for the pale dawn to address the crisis. The survival of the structure demanded an immediate, terrifying descent onto the surface of the frozen river in the absolute dead of the freezing night. She retreated to the heavy wooden tool chest located in the deepest corner of the silent milling room and retrieved a specialized piece of equipment rarely used by a single individual, the ice saw. This was not a standard carpenter's tool, but a massive, single-forged piece of heavy high-carbon steel, measuring nearly 6 feet in length. Its teeth were enormous and aggressively raked, designed specifically to tear forcefully through solid blocks of deep river ice on both the push and the pull stroke. It featured a heavy, cross-shaped wooden handle at one end, smoothed by decades of coarse friction. Bundling herself in every available layer of heavy fulled wool, cured sheepskin, and the stiff canvas windbreak, she carried the incredibly heavy, awkward iron saw out into the plunging temperatures. The cold was so absolute that the metal of the saw blade seemed to radiate a freezing aura, instantly numbing her thick woolen mittens. Navigating down the steep, snow-packed riverbank in complete darkness was incredibly treacherous, her stiff leather boots struggling to find purchase on the slick, frozen mud. When she finally stepped onto the surface of the river, the ice beneath her feet groaned loudly, a deep, unsettling vibration that travelled rapidly up her legs and resonated in her chest. The physical labour required to operate a two-man ice saw alone was agonising and brutally inefficient. She positioned herself several feet away from the first trapped cedar piling, aiming to cut a long, deep relief trench parallel to the foundation to absorb the crushing expansion. Raising the heavy iron blade, she drove the enormous steel teeth down into the surface of the ice. The first few strokes merely scratched the rock-hard surface, the steel chattering violently against the frozen water. Slowly, relying entirely on the weight of the massive tool rather than the exhausted strength of her own burning shoulders, the teeth began to bite. The sound of the saw tearing through the deep ice was a harsh, rhythmic, tearing noise that echoed loudly off the invisible, snow-covered ridges. As the heavy steel blade cut deeper, freezing river water rushed rapidly up through the narrow kerf, instantly turning to thick slush and crystallizing on her coarse woolen skirts and heavy boots. For hours she laboured in a state of absolute, exhausting physical meditation, her entire world reduced to the grueling push and pull of the heavy wooden handle, the violent metallic tearing of the ice, and the terrifying, unpredictable cracking of the massive frozen sheet shifting beneath her. By the time she had successfully cut a continuous 20-foot relief trench along the foundation, her entire body was trembling uncontrollably from extreme physical exhaustion and the relentless seeping cold. She dragged herself and the heavy iron saw back up the steep, slippery embankment just as the sky began to turn a bruised, pale grey, signalling the agonizingly slow arrival of dawn. Before retreating to the desperate warmth of the stone hearth, her exhausted eyes were drawn to the high, snow-cleared wooden ledge of the loading platform. The small square of tide-oiled linen that had contained the precious lump of coarse grey rock salt was completely gone. In its place rested an object that fundamentally shattered her entire understanding of the forgotten survivor on the high northern ridge. It was not another piece of trapped game, nor a woven basket of raw forage. It was a highly complex, precision-engineered mechanical component. She dropped the heavy ice saw into the deep snow and approached the platform, pulling off her frozen mitten to touch the object. It was a massive, meticulously hand-carved wooden thrust block, the exact specialized bearing designed to support the heavy base of the main vertical iron spindle within the mill's internal gearing. This was the precise mechanical part that had been slowly failing, the exact reason her father had undertaken the dangerous journey across the mountains before the great frost arrived. She picked up the heavy block, bringing it close to her tired eyes in the weak morning light. The craftsmanship was absolutely masterful, reflecting decades of highly specialized pre-industrial timber engineering. It was not carved from common oak or pine, but from a solid piece of ancient Alpine hornbeam, a wood so incredibly dense, heavy, and resistant to friction that it was known among local craftsmen as ironwood. The central mortise designed to hold the spinning iron spindle was perfectly cylindrical and had been carefully polished with rendered animal fat to a glassy, frictionless sheen. The realization hit her with the physical force of the freezing wind. The survivor was not a feral outcast. They were a master millwright possessing an intimate, profound understanding of complex rotary mechanics and timber engineering. Furthermore, for them to know exactly which highly specific component the mill required, they had to have been listening. Long before the river froze, the survivor must have stood in the dark, silent pine forest surrounding the valley, diagnosing the failing internal wooden gears entirely by the subtle, acoustic resonance and rhythmic pitch of the working millhouse. Carrying the heavy, flawless hornbeam thrust block into the freezing interior of the milling room, she immediately bypassed the living quarters and walked directly to the slanted wooden desk. She struck her flint with trembling, cold-stiffened hands, lighting the single tallow candle. The heavy, hammered brass clasps of the leather-bound flour ledger were freezing to the touch. She threw open the stiff, textured rag pages, turning rapidly to the final recorded section. There, written in the same crude, charcoal-grey pine soot ink, was a massive new entry that filled the entire bottom half of the page. It was not a simple tally of traded goods. It was a highly detailed, perfectly scaled architectural diagram of the mill's internal pitwheel and wallower assembly. Beside the drawing were lines of cramped, hurried text, utilizing highly specific, archaic mechanical terminology that detailed the exact geometric angles required to properly seat the new hornbeam-bearing block, warning of the specific acoustic signs of dangerous friction. The forgotten survivor exiled to the dead heights of the mountain was not just participating in a silent trade. They were actively and desperately attempting to repair the mechanical heart of the valley from the absolute shadows, utilizing their mastery to ensure the mill would survive the catastrophic winter. The young woman remained standing before the slanted wooden desk for a long time, the flickering light of the single tallow candle casting dancing shadows across the thick rag paper of the ledger. The architectural diagram drawn in the crude pine soot ink was not merely a set of instructions. It was a masterful mechanical translation of the mill's deepest vulnerabilities. By carefully studying the intersecting geometric lines and the archaic text detailing the specific angles of load distribution, she understood exactly how the mysterious survivor intended to save the grinding mechanism. The meticulously hand-carved Alpine hornbeam thrust block she had found on the loading platform was not designed to replace the vertically cracked iron spindle outright, a task that would require a forge and a team of men. Instead, it was engineered to encapsulate and completely stabilize the base of the failing shaft. The incredibly dense, frictionless nature of the ironwood mortise would absorb the erratic, destructive vibrations caused by the hairline fracture, preventing the spindle from shattering violently under the rotational torque when the river finally flowed again. To install this vital component, however, she had to perform the most dangerous solo mechanical operation possible within the structure, lifting the entire multi-ton vertical weight of the internal gearing system using nothing but primitive wooden leverage. The operation had to take place in the absolute lowest, most inaccessible level of the mill house, a cramped, subterranean space known as the tail race arch. Located directly beneath the stone wheel pit, this was the narrow exit channel where the rushing river water was expelled after driving the external water wheel. Currently, it was a terrifying cavern of jagged pressure ridges and frozen stalactites. She gathered her heaviest tools from the wooden chest in the silent milling room, a 10-pound iron maul with an ash handle, a series of heavily tapered oak wedges known among local millwrights as gluts, and a long, stout crowbar forged from hardened steel. Bundling herself tightly in her stiff canvas windbreak and heavy woolen shawls, she descended through a hidden trapdoor behind the stationary bedstone, navigating a narrow stone spiral staircase thickly coated in slippery hoarfrost. The air in the tail race arch was fundamentally different from the rest of the mill. It was heavy, stagnant, and so violently cold that it felt thick, resisting her movements as she waded through the frozen river mud and sharp ice shards toward the central supporting structure. Dominating this freezing, claustrophobic space was the bridge tree, a horizontal oak beam nearly 2 feet thick and 12 feet long. This enormous timber acted as the primary foundation for the entire vertical grinding assembly. Resting directly in the center of this beam was the shattered bearing block that currently held the cracked base of the iron spindle. Above this spindle sat the immense weight of the wallower gear, the iron rind, and the 1,000-pound upper runner stone. To remove the ruined bearing and insert the pristine hornbeam thrust block, she had to physically lift the bridge tree and everything resting upon it by at least 3 inches, holding it securely in mid-air. She knelt in the frozen, foul-smelling mud, positioning the first of the oak gluts into the narrow gap between the timber and the stone foundation corbel that supported its end. Swinging the iron maul in the cramped space was agonizing. She had no room to fully extend her arms, forcing her to rely entirely on the twisting strength of her torso to drive the iron head into the flat end of the wooden wedge. Each strike of the maul produced a deafening, percussive crack that echoed violently off the low stone ceiling, shaking loose showers of sharp ice crystals that rained down upon her woolen hood. Slowly, the heavy oak wedge drove deeper into the gap, forcing the bridge tree upward with a terrifying groan of stressed timber and shifting stone. She inserted a second wedge on the opposite side, moving back and forth, driving them evenly to ensure the vertical spindle above did not tilt and shatter the fragile applewood cogs of the pit wheel. The physical exertion in the sub-zero environment was incredibly dangerous. Her breathing became shallow and ragged, freezing air burning her lungs, while her leather boots began to freeze directly to the icy floor. When she had finally lifted the beam high enough, she inserted the long steel crowbar as a final safety lever, wedging it securely against a protruding foundation stone. The entire multi-ton assembly was now suspended precariously on the friction of the driven wedges and the bending strength of the steel bar. If either failed, the immense weight would instantly crush her hands against the stone. With trembling, cold-stiffened fingers, she reached into the dark cavity beneath the suspended iron spindle to extract the old bearing block. It was heavily splintered, soaked in rancid, frozen sheep tallow, and deeply gouged by the erratic friction of the cracked iron shaft. She pulled it free, tossing the ruined piece of wood into the mud, and retrieved the new Alpine hornbeam thrust block from her canvas apron. Recalling the precise architectural instructions recorded in the ledger, she aligned the perfectly cylindrical central mortise of the hornbeam block directly beneath the suspended base of the iron spindle. The dense ironwood was incredibly cold and smooth against her coarse mittens. Before sliding into position, she took a large handful of solid rendered sheep tallow from a small brass pan and packed it heavily into the polished mortise, ensuring the bearing would be thoroughly lubricated from the first rotation. She carefully pushed the meticulously carved block into the mortise slot on the top of the bridge tree, feeling a profound tactile satisfaction as the complex wooden joints locked together with absolute frictionless precision. The survivor on the high ridge had carved the massive block to a tolerance of mere fractions of an inch, working entirely from memory and acoustic deduction. The process of lowering the immense weight back down onto the new bearing was even more perilous than the lifting. She had to strike the sides of the oak gluts with the iron maul to slowly back them out of the gap, releasing the crushing tension incrementally. The bridge tree settled downward with a slow creak. As the heavy base of the cracked iron spindle finally made contact with the tallow-packed mortise of the new hornbeam block, it seated perfectly, the dense, unyielding ironwood completely absorbing and stabilizing the vulnerable fracture in the metal shaft. The internal mechanical heart of the mill was no longer in danger of catastrophic failure. She gathered her tools, dragging the iron maul and the steel crowbar back up the treacherous frost-coated spiral staircase, emerging finally into the dark, silent expanse of the main milling room. Returning to the slanted wooden desk, she sat heavily on the rough stool, her entire body aching with deep lactic exhaustion. She placed the shattered bearing block she had extracted from the tail race on the desk beside the flickering tallow candle, intending to use it for kindling. However, as the warm light washed over the frozen, grease-stained wood, a highly specific detail caught her eye. Along the squared outer edges of the ruined block were distinct tool marks left by a master millwright's adze, carved at a unique, slightly aggressive left-handed angle. She stood up and walked to the nearest structural oak pillar of the mill house itself, holding the candle close to the ancient hand-hewn timber. The adze marks on the structural beams, carved over 50 years ago during the initial construction of the mill, possessed the exact same unique left-handed striking angle. The forgotten survivor on the freezing Alpine ridge was not merely a skilled outcast. They were the original architect of the watermill itself, a master timberwright exiled to the desolate peaks for half a century, yet still silently maintaining the mechanical child they had built in the valley below. The realization that the isolated, forgotten survivor on the high Alpine ridge was the original master architect of the watermill completely altered the young woman's physical relationship with the massive timber structure surrounding her. Moving slowly through the freezing, silent milling room with the single tallow candle held high, she began to inspect the heavy oak framework not merely as a functional building, but as a deeply personal, historical text left behind by an exiled genius. The heavy, hand-hewn structural pillars, the massive horizontal tie beams, and the sweeping, curved knee braces that supported the immense weight of the slate roof were not simply nailed or bolted together. They were joined using an ancient, highly complex method of pre-industrial timber framing known as the square rule, relying entirely on intricately carved mortise and tenon joints secured by heavy, faceted wooden pegs. For decades, she had walked past these massive joints without fully understanding the profound level of mathematical precision and spatial reasoning required to construct them. Now illuminated by the warm, flickering candlelight, she sought out the specific, localized markings left by the master builder half a century prior. To construct a timber frame of this immense scale, a master timberite could not simply build from the ground up. The entire complex skeleton of the mill had to be meticulously measured, cut, and temporarily assembled flat on the ground in a nearby grassy meadow, a process known as framing out. Because no two hand-hewn oak logs were perfectly straight or identical in dimension, every single joint was entirely unique and completely non-interchangeable. To ensure the massive pieces of timber were reassembled in the exact correct order when the frame was finally raised vertically onto the stone foundation, the master builder carved specific geometric signatures, known as marriage marks, into the face of the wood across every intersecting joint. She traced her freezing, calloused fingers over these marks, finding them deeply etched into the ancient oak, long, clean slices made by a razor-sharp framing chisel, forming complex variations of Roman numerals, combined with distinct, left-handed slashes that perfectly matched the adze marks on the ruined bearing block. The pegs securing these joints, she realized with growing awe, were not made of the same oak as the beams. They were carved from dense, heavily seasoned black locust wood and had been intentionally driven into the mortises, while the surrounding oak was still green and unseasoned. As the massive oak beams slowly dried and shrank over the decades, they tightened around the unyielding locust pegs with immense, crushing force, permanently locking the entire timber structure together into an immovable, rigid monolith capable of withstanding the violent vibrations of the heavy grinding stones and the catastrophic gales of the Great Frost. The historical context surrounding the exile of such a masterful engineer to the desolate, freezing heights of the northern ridge was rooted in the violent, chaotic decades that followed the 30 Years' War. When the region was ravaged by mercenary armies, famine, and localized plagues, the isolated valleys often turned inward, yielding to deep paranoia and violent superstition. A master builder, possessing an almost supernatural understanding of geometry, hydrodynamics, and structural physics, often existed on the absolute fringe of rural peasant society. Their ability to harness the raw, terrifying power of the river, to manipulate massive weights with invisible levers, and to read the subtle languages of timber and stone was frequently viewed with deep suspicion by the uneducated, terrified populace. It was entirely probable that following a devastating localized crop failure or a bitter, violent dispute over the communal rights to the river water, the master architect had been violently driven from the valley he had helped sustain, forced into permanent exile among the ruined stone foundations of the high, inaccessible Alpine peaks, taking his profound mechanical secrets with him into the freezing clouds. The immediate reality of the deep freeze, however, prevented her from dwelling endlessly on the tragic historical injustices of the previous century. The brutal, crystalline cold of the Parhelion sky remained firmly entrenched over the valley, and the small stone hearth in the living quarters was rapidly becoming a severe liability. The intense high-pressure system had completely neutralized the atmospheric draft required to pull the heavy wood smoke up the wide stone chimney. Burning the dense, raw oak logs she had hauled from the frozen shed now resulted in the small room rapidly filling with a thick, acrid haze that caused severe respiratory distress and threatened carbon monoxide poisoning in the tightly sealed space. To generate the intense, life-sustaining heat required to survive the plunging sub-zero nights without producing the deadly, suffocating smoke, she had to convert a portion of her raw timber into pure, high-carbon fuel. She had to manufacture charcoal entirely indoors, She retrieved a massive, heavy cast-iron cauldron, a vessel normally reserved for rendering huge quantities of autumn pork fat, and dragged it across the rough stone floorboards toward the hearth. She carefully selected the densest, driest pieces of split beech and oak from her dwindling stockpile, chopping them into small, uniform wooden blocks using her iron hand axe. She packed these hardwood blocks incredibly tightly into the cast-iron cauldron, ensuring there was absolutely no wasted space. To convert the raw wood into charcoal, it had to be subjected to extreme, prolonged heat in the total absence of atmospheric oxygen, a chemical process known as pyrolysis. If any oxygen reached the hot wood, it would simply combust and burn down to useless white ash. To seal the heavy vessel, she took a bucket of frozen river mud she had chipped from the banks during her terrifying night on the ice, slowly thawing it near the dying embers until it became a thick, pliable clay. She spread this dense, heavy mud thickly over the top of the packed wood, pressing the heavy iron lid down firmly and sealing the outer rim with another thick layer of the wet clay, creating an airtight, primitive retort. She carefully positioned the sealed, incredibly heavy cast-iron cauldron directly into the center of the deep stone hearth, banking a large, intensely hot fire of raw oak logs completely around and over the iron vessel. The process of indoor pyrolysis was agonizingly slow and required constant, meticulous observation. For hours, the intense heat of the exterior fire baked the sealed iron cauldron. Slowly, a small pressurized jet of yellowish, heavy vapor began to escape from a microscopic hairline crack in the clay seal. This was the raw moisture and volatile resins boiling out of the trapped wood. The smell was incredibly sharp and acrid, forcing her to carefully manage the cracked window shutter to maintain a safe cross breeze despite the freezing temperatures. As the long hours dragged on into the deep night, the color of the escaping vapor slowly transitioned from the heavy yellow smoke to a thin, pale, almost invisible blue gas. This indicated that all the water and raw tars had been completely driven from the wood, and the blocks were now transforming into pure, concentrated carbon. She allowed the exterior fire to slowly die down to white ash, leaving the heavy iron cauldron buried in the residual heat to slowly cool over the next 12 hours. When she finally cracked the hardened clay seal the following afternoon, the cauldron was filled with lightweight, profoundly black, brittle pieces of pure hardwood charcoal. When ignited, this concentrated fuel burned with a fierce, intense, almost invisible blue flame, radiating massive amounts of pure thermal energy into the freezing stone room with absolutely zero smoke, securing her immediate survival against the suffocating high-pressure freeze. With the stone living quarters finally secured with a reliable, smokeless heat source, her attention returned to the urgent, desperate food crisis facing the isolated tenant farmers of the valley. While she had managed to secure fresh protein for herself through the silent, invisible trade with the master builder on the ridge, she knew the large farming families trapped in their snowbound hillside cabins were rapidly exhausting their meager winter rations. The great millstones remained silent, locked in the frozen grip of the immobilized external water wheel. She could not process their raw grain into flour. Her only remaining communal asset was the deep subterranean root cellar located beneath the stone foundation of the living quarters, a heavily insulated earthen vault that utilized the constant thermal mass of the deep soil to remain slightly above freezing, regardless of the catastrophic atmospheric temperatures above ground. Lighting her tallow candle, she opened the heavy oak trapdoor in the floorboards and descended the steep packed earth steps into the profound darkness of the cellar. The air here was entirely different from the rest of the freezing mill. It was heavy, damp, and smelled intensely of rich soil, geosmin, and the sweet, lingering scent of resting apples. The root cellar was organized with meticulous, agricultural precision. Massive wooden bins lined the damp stone walls, filled entirely with fine, dry river sand hauled from the summer banks. Buried deeply within this insulating sand were hundreds of pounds of dense, heavy root vegetables, tough winter turnips, long pale parsnips, thick carrots, and hardy rutabagas. Burying the vegetables in dry sand was absolutely critical for long-term winter storage. It prevented the roots from losing their internal moisture and shriveling into useless husks, while simultaneously preventing the rapid, catastrophic spread of fungal rot by isolating each individual vegetable from its neighbor. In a separate, heavily partitioned section of the cellar, resting on slatted wooden shelves designed for maximum airflow, were the winter apples. Apples released a heavy, invisible ethylene gas as they slowly ripened in storage, a natural chemical compound that would rapidly accelerate the decay of the buried root vegetables if the air was not carefully managed. She began the exhausting, meticulous task of individually inspecting the stored food. Pulling heavy turnips from the cold sand, she used a small, razor-sharp paring knife to carefully carve away any small, soft spots of emerging rot, preventing the decay from spreading to the healthy flesh. She began to carefully pack heavy woven hemp sacks with measured, strictly rationed portions of the sound root vegetables, preparing to drag them out into the frozen, deeply buried valley to distribute a desperate lifeline to the starving farming families completely isolated by the great frost. The distribution of the heavy root vegetables required outfitting the flat-bottomed ashwood sledge for a grueling overland journey. The thick hemp ropes used to secure the heavy woven sacks were frozen completely rigid in the sub-zero air, resembling twisted iron bars rather than flexible cordage. The young woman had to meticulously thaw the thick ropes near the intense, smokeless heat of her indoor charcoal fire, just to make them pliable enough to tie a proper diamond hitch. This complex, interlacing knot was absolutely critical. If the heavy sacks shifted and unbalanced the sledge on a steep, snow-packed incline, the entire load could overturn, potentially tearing the sacks and losing the precious, life-saving vegetables into the bottomless, powdery snowdrifts. She strapped the stiff leather pulling harness across her heavy canvas windbreak, ensuring the wide leather band rested squarely across her chest and shoulders to distribute the punishing weight. Leaving the silent, frozen sanctuary of the mill house, she stepped out into a valley that had been completely erased of all human geography. The familiar dirt cart paths, the low stone boundary walls, and the wooden pasture fences were entirely buried under several feet of hardened, wind-sculpted snow. To reach the isolated hillside farmsteads, she was forced to use the frozen, treacherous surface of the river as her primary highway. Navigating the frozen river was an agonizing test of physical endurance and constant, terrifying vigilance. The surface was not a smooth, flat sheet of ice. The violent hydrostatic pressures of the deep freeze had caused massive slabs of the frozen river to buckle and thrust upward, creating a chaotic, jagged landscape of sharp pressure ridges and deep, snow-filled fissures. The air was violently cold, the crystalline Parhelian sky absolutely no warmth. The snow covering the river ice had been scoured by the recent gale into hard wave-like ridges known as sastrugi, which violently caught the iron-bound runners of her wooden sledge, forcing her to constantly jerk and twist the heavy load to keep it moving forward. Every step required her to aggressively strike the ice ahead of her with her iron-tipped walking staff, testing the structural integrity of the frozen surface. Despite the catastrophic ambient temperatures, the rapid, deep currents flowing beneath the ice could still create highly dangerous, thin spots, particularly near the submerged boulders of the summer rapids. The sound of her heavy leather boots and the shrieking wooden runners of the sledge echoed loudly off the sheer, frozen cliffs of the valley, a lonely, desperate rhythm in the absolute, crushing silence of the great frost. After 3 hours of grueling, continuous labour, pulling the dead weight uphill against the frozen gradient of the river, she reached the steep, snow-choked ravine leading to the first tenant farmstead. The physical structure of the peasant dwelling was barely visible against the blinding white landscape. It was a traditional cruck-framed longhouse, built using naturally curved timber piers that stretched directly from the ground to the ridge of the roof, resembling the inverted ribs of a massive wooden ship. The walls were constructed of simple wattle and daub, heavily degraded by the freezing winds, and the thick thatched roof of dried river reeds was sagging precariously under the immense, crushing tonnage of the accumulated snow. The most terrifying aspect of the isolated farmstead, however, was the complete, absolute absence of smoke rising from the central roof hole. In the brutal depths of a 1709 winter, a cold hearth was an immediate, undeniable indicator of impending mass starvation and severe hypothermia. The young woman dropped the heavy leather harness, her shoulders burning with lactic agony, and waded through the waist-deep drifts to the low, heavy wooden door. It was frozen solidly into the frame, requiring her to use her stout walking staff as a primitive lever to forcefully pry the thick oak planks open, shattering the heavy seal of hoarfrost with a loud, violent crack. The interior of the crook-framed longhouse was a grim, freezing cavern of profound human suffering. The air inside was completely stagnant, smelling intensely of unwashed wool, cold wood ash, and the sharp metallic tang of severe malnutrition. The single large room was plunged into deep shadows, the small parchment windows completely blocked by the exterior snowdrifts. Huddled together in the absolute center of the dirt floor, entirely buried under a massive chaotic pile of ragged woven blankets, cured sheepskins, and loose, dry straw, was the farming family. They were attempting to cool their rapidly failing body heat, engaging in a desperate, primitive hibernation. The patriarch of the family, a man whose face was heavily weathered by decades of brutal agricultural labor, emerged slowly from the pile. His skin was pale and tightly drawn over his cheekbones, his lips a frightening shade of bruised blue. He lacked the physical strength to even stand, dragging himself across the freezing dirt floor to meet her. The young woman did not waste precious energy on spoken greetings. She immediately dragged a heavy hemp sack from the sledge into the dark room, slicing the thick twine binding it with her skinning knife. The heavy, dirt-covered turnips and long, pale parsnips tumbled out onto the frozen earth, a massive vital influx of dense, life-sustaining calories. The farmer stared at the raw root vegetables with a look of profound, silent shock, his trembling hands reaching out to grasp a heavy turnip as if it were solid gold. The young woman knelt beside him, rapidly instructing him to bury the roots deeply in the cold ashes of the hearth. Even without an active fire, the deep, residual thermal mass of the heavily packed ash would slowly draw the freezing moisture out of the dense vegetables, partially softening them and preventing the raw, frozen fibers from violently shocking their severely weakened digestive systems. As she turned to leave, knowing she had several more miles of agonizing river dragging ahead of her to reach the other isolated families, the exhausted farmer grasped the coarse wool of her heavy canvas apron. His voice was a thin, raspy whisper, cracked by severe dehydration and cold. He pointed a trembling, frostbitten finger toward the heavily patched, sagging, thatched roof above them. He explained, in halted, breathless syllables, that 2 nights prior, during the absolute height of the blinding blizzard, they had heard a heavy, deliberate movement on the roof. Assuming it was a starving mountain wolf attempting to dig through the thatch, they had huddled in terror, waiting for the end. Instead, a large, tightly bound bundle had been violently shoved down through the open central smoke hole, crashing onto the cold hearth. The farmer gestured weakly toward a dark corner of the room. Resting there was the remains of the bundle. Several thick, heavily resinous branches of ancient mountain pine, absolutely premium firewood capable of generating intense, life-saving heat, and the scattered pure white feathers of a large alpine ptarmigan. The isolated farmstead had absolutely no access to mountain pine, which only grew above the tree line on the highest, most inaccessible rocky crags of the northern ridge. The young woman stared at the scattered white feathers and the dense pine bark, the profound reality of the situation washing over her like a physical blow. The master millwright, the exiled timber architect of the valley, was not merely surviving in the ruined heights. He was utilizing his intimate, masterful knowledge of the treacherous alpine geography and his primitive snowshoes to actively patrol the high ridges during the most violent meteorological events, bypassing the impassable, snow-choked valley floor entirely. He was acting as a silent, phantom guardian, dropping desperate, life-saving caches of high-altitude fuel and trapped game directly into the chimneys of the dying village below. The heavy leather ledger in the mill was not just an accounting of trade. It was a highly coordinated, silent logistical map of community survival, orchestrated by a ghost in the freezing clouds. The grueling journey back down the treacherous, jagged surface of the frozen river with the empty ashwood sledge was conducted in a state of profound physical exhaustion and intense mental clarity. The pale, crystalline light of the perihelion sky was beginning to fade behind the towering western ridges, casting long, sharp shadows across the wind-sculpted snow waves of the sastrugi. The young woman leaned heavily into the stiff leather pulling harness, her heavy leather boots slipping and sliding against the rock-hard ice. Her body was running entirely on the dense, slow-burning complex carbohydrates, provided by the bitter pine bark famine bread she had consumed earlier, a heavy, resinous mass resting solidly in her stomach. Yet, despite the agonizing lactic acid burning in her thighs and the sharp, freezing air cutting painfully into her lungs, her mind was entirely focused on the monumental logistical reality she had just uncovered in the starving village. The isolated tenant farmers were not merely enduring the great frost alone, they were being systematically kept alive by a phantom architect. The exiled master millwright, utilizing his primitive snowshoes and his intimate knowledge of the high alpine ecosystem, was executing a massive, silent operation of community preservation, navigating sheer cliffs and blinding blizzards to drop trapped mountain game and highly resinous pine wood directly down the chimneys of the dying cruck-framed longhouses, arriving at the heavy timber silhouette of the mill house, just as absolute darkness consumed the valley. She bypassed the living quarters entirely and waded through the deep snowdrifts directly toward the massive, immobilized external water wheel. The wheel was completely locked within a solid, chaotic mass of frozen white river water, its thick wooden paddles encased in tons of unyielding ice. For weeks, she had focused all her energy and mechanical understanding on preserving the internal wooden gearing system from the catastrophic plunging temperatures and the expanding moisture. The meticulously carved Alpine hornbeam thrust block now securely supported the cracked iron spindle, ensuring the internal heart of the mill was ready to beat. However, as she stood in the freezing darkness staring at the massive, trapped external wheel, the terrifying reality of the future suddenly materialized in her mind. The Great Frost, despite its current absolute dominance, was a meteorological anomaly that would eventually break. When the high-pressure Arctic dome finally collapsed and the spring thaw arrived, the millions of tons of frozen water locked within the valley, and the surrounding mountains would be violently unleashed. The river would not simply melt, it would shatter. Massive, multi-ton blocks of solid ice, some the size of small peasant cabins, would be carried downstream by a catastrophic torrent of freezing meltwater. This highly destructive phenomenon, known as a freshet, carried immense kinetic energy. If these massive ice flows were allowed to violently impact the broad, flat paddles of the immobilized wooden water wheel, the sheer kinetic force would instantly shatter the ancient oak axle, completely destroying the mill's only source of external power and rendering all their internal repairs entirely useless. She entered the freezing milling room, pulling off her stiff woolen mittens, and immediately struck a flint to light the single tallow candle resting on the slanted wooden desk. She opened the heavy brass clasps of the leather-bound flour ledger, turning rapidly to the final pages. She anticipated another message, another highly precise mechanical instruction from the master builder on the ridge. Sensing that their silent, unspoken partnership had evolved beyond mere survival trading and into the highly complex realm of long-term structural defense, her intuition was absolutely correct. Directly beneath the previous diagram of the internal pit wheel, drawn in the same crude charcoal grey pine soot ink, was a completely new architectural schematic. The exiled millwright had perfectly anticipated the catastrophic threat of the coming freshet. The diagram detailed the construction of a massive defensive timber structure known in ancient river engineering as a starling, or an icebreaker. It was a heavy, triangular wooden barricade designed to be positioned directly upstream of the vulnerable water wheel. The sharp, angled leading edge of the triangle would face the oncoming current, designed to physically split the massive, rushing ice flows in half, violently deflecting the heavy blocks safely around the sides of the wheel housing before they could make impact. The diagram in the ledger, however, revealed a brilliant, desperate modification necessitated by the extreme conditions of the Great Frost. A traditional starling required heavy cedar pilings to be driven deeply into the muddy riverbed, an absolute physical impossibility, while the river was covered in several feet of iron-hard ice. Instead, the master timberwright had designed a surface-anchored starling, relying entirely on the brutal freezing temperatures to secure the structure. The young woman had to construct the heavy triangular barricade directly on the surface of the frozen river ice upstream of the wheel, utilizing her remaining stockpile of massive split oak logs. To bind the heavy timbers together, the diagram instructed her to use a primitive, incredibly strong compound known as slush mortar. By heavily mixing loose powdery snow with freezing river water chipped from the relief trench, she could pack the heavy, wet slush around the intersecting timber joints. Within minutes, the violently cold ambient air would freeze the wet slush into a solid mass of structural ice, possessing a compressive strength comparable to cured stone mortar, permanently anchoring the massive wooden barricade directly to the frozen surface of the river. The physical construction of the icebreaker required an entire night of grueling, agonizing labor under the pale, freezing light of the winter stars. She dragged the heaviest oak logs from the timber shed, utilizing the flat-bottomed ashwood sledge to move the massive weights onto the slick river ice, approximately 20 feet upstream from the trapped water wheel. Using her heavy iron hand axe, she meticulously notched the ends of the logs, employing a crude but effective lap joint to form the sharp leading edge of the heavy triangular frame. The physical exertion was immense, her back and shoulders screaming with exhaustion as she lifted and positioned the dense, unyielding timber. Once the primary triangular footprint was established, she began the incredibly cold, punishing task of mixing the slush mortar. She had to remove her thick outer mittens, relying only on thin boiled wool liners to maintain the necessary dexterity. She chipped heavy chunks of ice from the river surface, letting them melt slightly in a cast iron bucket placed near a small charcoal brazier she dragged out onto the ice. She rapidly scooped the freezing, viscous slurry of water and snow with her bare, protected hands, packing it heavily around the notched oak joints and violently pounding it into the gaps between the timber and the irregular surface of the frozen river. The slush mortar reacted exactly as the master builder's diagram had predicted. The moment the wet, freezing mixture was packed into place and removed from the radiant heat of her own hands, the catastrophic ambient cold seized it. The slush crystallized instantly, expanding slightly as it froze, locking the heavy oak timbers together in an unbreakable, iron-hard grip. She worked relentlessly through the darkest hours of the freezing night, stacking subsequent layers of heavy oak logs and packing them solidly with the freezing slurry, slowly raising the height of the triangular barricade until it stood taller than her own waist. The sharp, angled leading edge pointed directly north, a massive, unyielding wedge of solid oak and structural ice standing in silent defiance of the frozen river. When the pale, bruised light of dawn finally began to creep over the eastern ridges, the defensive starling was complete. It was a brutal, ugly structure, lacking any of the refined, polished craftsmanship of the internal hornbeam thrust block, but it possessed massive, undeniable kinetic mass. She stood exhausted on the ice, her heavy woolen clothing coated in a thick armor of frozen slush, leaning heavily on her iron-tipped walking staff. She looked up past the towering pine forest, her eyes fixing on the jagged, desolate crags of the high northern ridge. Through the medium of the heavy leather ledger and the crude pine soot ink, she and the exiled master timberwright had achieved perfect, unspoken mechanical symmetry, working in absolute unison across miles of freezing, hostile geography to secure the physical future of the valley. The static, crushing dominance of the Great Frost held the isolated valley in its absolute grip for 3 more agonizing weeks following the desperate construction of the defensive starling. The young woman existed in a state of suspended physical exhaustion, heavily reliant on the slow-burning thermal energy of her indoor charcoal retort and the harsh, bitter sustenance of the pine bark famine bread. The days blurred into a monotonous cycle of survival maintenance, dictated entirely by the crystalline, motionless air and the pale, freezing Parhelion sky. The heavy oak barricade she had built on the surface of the frozen river remained untested, a silent triangular monument of slush mortar and raw timber waiting for an inevitable, violent geological collision. Then, on the late afternoon of March the 4th, the atmospheric pressure violently shifted. The agonizingly sharp, high-pressure Arctic dome that had suffocated the continent finally began to collapse. The wind, which had blown relentlessly from the freezing northern peaks, suddenly died away completely, leaving a brief, heavy vacuum in the valley. Hours later, a new breeze began to stir, sweeping up from the deep south. It carried no ice crystals or blinding snow. Instead, it brought a heavy, saturated moisture and the distinct, incredibly raw scent of wet earth and thawing pine needles. The ambient temperature, which had remained dangerously below zero for months, rapidly climbed above the freezing point. The Great Frost was breaking, The thaw did not arrive as a gentle, gradual melting of the winter snows. In the steep, heavily forested alpine geography, a rapid temperature increase triggers a catastrophic hydrological event known as a freshet. The immense, crushing tonnage of snow that had accumulated on the high ridges and at the upper slopes began to liquefy simultaneously, sending thousands of gallons of raw meltwater rushing violently down beneath the surface of the frozen river. The hydrostatic pressure beneath the ice, which had previously expanded outward to crush the cedar pilings, now reversed its dynamic. The river began to swell aggressively upward, lifting the massive, multi-foot-thick sheet of surface ice with terrifying, undeniable force. The acoustic reality of this event was deafening. The continuous, deep booming of the ice fracturing under the immense hydraulic lift echoed through the valley like a rolling artillery barrage. Deep, jagged fissures rapidly spiderwebbed across the frozen surface, exposing the dark, furiously rushing water beneath. The young woman stood on the elevated wooden loading platform, her heavy canvas windbreak discarded in the sudden, startling warmth of the southern breeze, watching the terrifying destruction of the frozen landscape she had navigated for months. When the primary ice jam located several miles upstream finally ruptured, it released a massive localized tidal wave of dark, muddy meltwater heavily laden with enormous, jagged chunks of dirty river ice. This wall of kinetic destruction roared around the bend in the valley, tearing the ancient pines from the riverbanks and completely scouring the muddy shoreline. The young woman gripped the heavy wooden railing of the platform, her breath catching in her throat as the leading edge of the freshet surged directly toward the vulnerable timber mill house. The massive ice floes, some weighing several tons and possessing the sheer physical density of solid rock, accelerated down the swollen channel. They struck the heavy, triangular oak starling she had constructed on the ice with a sickening, violent impact that shook the entire bedrock foundation of the mill. The brutal, primitive engineering of the icebreaker was immediately subjected to extreme, catastrophic stress. The freezing slush mortar, which had cured into a density rivaling Roman concrete during the deep freeze, held the heavily notched lap joints securely together. The sharp, angled leading edge of the oak barricade performed its hydrodynamic duty perfectly. As the massive ice block slammed into the apex of the triangle, the heavy timber wedge physically split them in half, violently deflecting the immense kinetic energy outward and routing the destructive flows safely around the sides of the immobilized external water wheel. With the primary, catastrophic impacts safely deflected by the starling, the rushing, dark meltwater quickly began to rapidly erode the remaining thick ice, encasing the wide wooden paddles of the great wheel. The young woman did not wait for the sun to finish the job. She retrieved her long, heavy steel crowbar and cautiously navigated the muddy, thawing riverbank, stepping onto the heavy stone foundation nearest the wheel housing. Reaching out over the rushing, freezing torrent, she aggressively pried the remaining stubborn blocks of ice away from the heavy oak spokes. As the lowest paddles finally broke free and caught the immense, rushing current of the swollen river, the massive iron axle, completely locked in its wooden bearings for nearly 3 months, let out a deep, agonizing groan of stressed metal and heavily compressed timber. The immense physical friction was terrifying, but the dense, rendered sheep tallow she had painstakingly applied deep into the joints during the darkest freezing nights of the winter held its viscosity. Slowly, heavily, resisting the inertia of a dead season, the massive wooden wheel began to turn. As it completed its first full rotation, shedding massive sheets of freezing water and residual ice into the air, the rhythmic, splashing heartbeat of the valley was definitively restored. The young woman immediately abandoned the riverbank, sprinting up the muddy slope and throwing open the heavy oak doors of the milling room. She bypassed the slanted wooden desk entirely, rushing directly to the hidden trapdoor and descending the damp stone spiral staircase into the subterranean tailrace arch. The air here was no longer stagnant and freezing. It was violently turbulent, filled with the deafening roar of the expelled meltwater rushing through the narrow stone channel. The heavy timber bridge tree she had painstakingly lifted with wedges, and the iron maul was vibrating heavily, alive with kinetic energy. Resting securely within its center, the meticulously hand-carved Alpine hornbeam thrust block was performing flawlessly. As the vertical iron spindle spun rapidly within the polished, tallow-packed mortise, The incredibly dense ironwood completely absorbed the erratic, destructive vibrations caused by the hairline fracture. The master timberwright's architectural genius, transmitted via the crude pine soot diagram, completely stabilized the failing mechanical heart of the mill, transferring the immense rotational power smoothly and securely upward into the main gearing assembly. Climbing back into the main milling room, the young woman approached the heavy wooden tentering gear. With trembling hands, she adjusted the complex system of levers, slowly lowering the massive 1,000-pound sandstone runner stone until it made precise, grinding contact with the stationary bedstone. The sheer, deafening roar of the heavy stones rotating against one another filled the dusty room, a beautiful, overwhelming sound of absolute mechanical salvation. She rushed to the heavy wooden hoppers, releasing the iron sluice gates to allow the long-stored, freezing grain to finally pour down through the wooden chute and into the central eye of the spinning runner stone. The sharp, meticulously dressed furrows she had spent hours carving with her steel mill bill sheared the hard grain with absolute, flawless precision. Within seconds, a continuous heavy stream of fine, consistent, perfectly warm flour began to cascade down the wooden collection trough. The deep, resonating rumble of the massive millstones, a low, powerful frequency that carried for miles, echoed up the thawing valley slopes. It was a mechanical trumpet announcing the definitive end of the famine, signalling to every isolated cruck-framed longhouse that the heavy timber engine of their communal survival had awakened from the great frost. By mid-afternoon, the muddy, thawing cart paths leading to the mill house were filled with the exhausted, emaciated figures of the local tenant farmers. They arrived pulling small wooden handcarts or carrying meagre sacks of remaining winter wheat over their heavily stooped shoulders, their faces reflecting a profound, silent mixture of deep trauma and absolute relief. The young woman stood at the heavy wrought iron scale, receiving their grain and returning the heavy, life-sustaining sacks of fresh flour, refusing absolutely any toll for the milling. The valley had survived on the razor's edge of total collapse, sustained only by the rationed root vegetables, the phantom deliveries of the exiled architect, and her own relentless defense of the timber structure. As the evening shadows lengthened across the rushing, swollen river, and the last of the farmers began their slow, muddy trek back to their hillside cabins, she returned to the slanted wooden desk. She opened the heavy leather-bound ledger. Taking her quill and the dark oak gall ink, she recorded the massive influx of milled grain, carefully documenting the survival of the village. But before she closed the heavy brass clasps, she prepared one final, vital transaction. She filled a small, tightly woven linen sack with the absolute finest, warmest flour from the very first milling of the spring. She carried it out to the wet, thawing wooden loading platform, placing it precisely on the designated ledge. It was a silent, profound payment for the mechanical blueprints and the life-saving game, a final offering to the ghost in the clouds who had built the very walls that kept them alive. The small linen sack of fine, warm spring flour left upon the wet wooden loading platform vanished by the following dawn, marking the final silent exchange between the valley and the desolate heights. In the weeks that followed, the catastrophic power of the freshet slowly subsided, leaving the swollen river to settle back into its familiar rushing summer channel. The heavy triangular oak starling, having sustained immense structural damage from the violent impacts of the multi-ton ice flows, was carefully dismantled by the young woman. She waded into the freezing shallows, using her long steel crowbar to pry the heavily notched lap joints apart, breaking the remaining bonds of the slush mortar that had held so fiercely during the deep freeze. She salvaged the shattered timber, dragging the heavy oak logs up the muddy bank and stacking them meticulously in the timber shed to dry in the warming spring sun. These battered, scarred logs would serve as crucial firewood for the following winter, ensuring that not a single piece of the master builder's desperate defensive architecture was wasted. The internal mechanics of the mill, however, remained permanently altered. The dense Alpine hornbeam thrust block continued to perform with absolute, frictionless perfection, holding the cracked iron spindle securely in its heavy mortise. It was a localized mechanical miracle that sustained the grinding operations completely uninterrupted throughout the desperately busy spring season, as the starving valley rushed to process the last of its hidden grain stores. It was late April when the steep, snow-choked mountain passes finally cleared enough for human travel. The deep alpine drift slowly gave way to vast, muddy tracts of exposed granite and blooming highland heather. The older miller returned to the valley leading his aging, exhausted mule, carrying a newly forged, incredibly heavy iron spindle from the distant manufacturing town. The journey had been a grueling ordeal of freezing rain and treacherous mudslides, and he fully expected to find his valley in ruins. In the major cities beyond the mountains, the news was apocalyptic. He had heard terrifying accounts of mass starvation, frozen rivers destroying entire fleets of merchant barges, and a desperate peasantry rioting for coarse bread. He anticipated finding the timber mill house completely silent, the delicate wooden machinery shattered by the great frost, and the local tenant farmers in the grips of catastrophic starvation. Instead, as he crested the final ridge and looked down into the forested valley, he was greeted by the deep, resonant, continuous roar of the heavy sandstone millstones. He saw the dark, freshly turned soil of the hillside fields and the thin, ragged, but undeniably alive tenant farmers planting their early spring crops. When the father finally reached the mill and descended into the dark, damp subterranean tailrace arch, he beheld the masterful timber engineering of the hornbeam bearing. He ran his calloused fingers over the perfectly polished mortise and the dense, unyielding ironwood that was smoothly absorbing the violent torque of the massive stones above. Later that evening, sitting by the warm stone hearth, he turned the stiff rag pages of the heavy leather-bound flower ledger to study the highly precise charcoal-grey architectural diagrams. He recognized the unique left-handed adze marks depicted in the sketches and the intricate, flawless geometry of the square rule joinery instantly. The older miller understood with profound silent reverence that the valley had been saved by the exiled ghost of its own founding architect. He did not speak of it to the local villagers, knowing that the deep-seated superstitions and ancient paranoias that had driven the master builder into the freezing clouds half a century prior still lingered in the isolated community. The new iron spindle he had travelled so far to procure was carefully coated in heavy sheep tallow to prevent rust and stored in the darkest corner of the milling room, where it would remain completely unused, gathering flour dust for another 3 decades. The Great Frost of 1709 left a devastating, permanent scar across the entire European continent. Historical and meteorological records from the era detail catastrophic agricultural failures on an unprecedented scale. Entire regions lost their winter wheat crops, ancient olive groves in the Mediterranean froze solid to the root, and vast, historic vineyards died entirely off across France and the Holy Roman Empire. The Baltic Sea froze so deeply that heavily laden merchant caravans could cross from Denmark to Sweden entirely on horseback. The resulting widespread famine and subsequent localized economic collapses forced massive demographic shifts, altering the political and social landscape for a generation. Yet, nestled within this broader macrocosmic tragedy of continental devastation, the isolated, heavily forested valley remained an obscure, unrecorded anomaly of survival. The tenant farmers recovered, their wattle and daub longhouses were repaired with fresh river reeds and spring mud, and their communal grain stores were slowly, painstakingly replenished over the following abundant summer harvests. The structural integrity of the timber-framed watermill, bound together by the unyielding black locust pegs and the masterfully calculated square rule joinery, stood immovable against the rushing river, a silent monument to the engineering genius of a forgotten outcast. The heavy, leather-bound flower ledger eventually ran out of blank pages. The young woman, slowly growing into a master miller in her own right as her father aged and eventually passed, carefully bound a new massive volume using fresh rag paper and dark, freshly crushed oak gall ink. The old ledger, with its heavy hammered brass clasps and its deeply disturbing, magnificent historical record, was wrapped tightly in heavy oiled canvas and stored securely within the bottom of the heavy wooden tool chest. Decades later, when the valley eventually opened to wider trade routes and the era of pre-industrial timber framing began to fade, historians or descendants, finding the massive book, would run their fingers over the faded, sepia-toned entries of mundane agricultural commerce, only to suddenly encounter the frantic charcoal-grey pine soot diagrams and the impossible deposits of ancient high-altitude mountain rye. The ledger stood as the only physical, documentary evidence of the silent partnership forged in the absolute darkest depths of the winter, a testament to the profound resilience of the forgotten people who existed entirely on the absolute margins of the historical record. As the years quietly turned into decades, the deep trauma of the Great Frost faded slowly into localized folklore, a story told by the older tenant farmers beside warm winter hearths while the snow fell softly outside. The steep, treacherous northern ridge remained completely abandoned, its ruined stone foundations eventually swallowed entirely by the encroaching alpine timberline and the slow creep of the ancient pine forests. No further tracks of primitive snowshoes were ever found near the bubbling geothermal spring, and no more heavily weathered, carved wooden bowls were left upon the frosty stones. The master builder, having fulfilled his final, desperate obligation to the mechanical child he had created in the valley, faded back into the absolute silence of the high peaks, leaving behind only the flawless geometry of his timber joints. The young miller's daughter continued her daily, exhausting labour, rising hours before dawn to engage the heavy wooden sluice gate in the freezing morning mist. Her hands grew heavily calloused, and her ears remained finely attuned to the precise rhythmic pitch of the massive water wheel. The deep, heavy grinding of the massive stones became a perpetual, comforting lullaby for the isolated valley, a slow, continuous mechanical heartbeat that drowned out the silence of the deep forests. The turning of the wooden wheel, the rushing of the dark river water, and the fine, warm dust of the milled grain settled evenly over the heavy oak timbers, quietly burying the past and sustaining the future, day after day, season after season, until the very end of her days,